Friendship will not come before my obligation to my people. Ned met Bolton's gaze. There would never be friendship between them. Ned would always believe that Roose Bolton's tactics were too harsh and too unforgiving, but he could also understand a man making those choices when he believed he was facing his own death. No, not just his own death, which was inevitable. All men must eventually go to that void. But what they were facing was the death of their families, their legacies, their culture and the very North itself. Yes, they could both understand the necessity of acting when the stakes were that high. Bolton nodded. I'd planned to ask if I could escort you to Castle Lionel and inspect it for myself, but perhaps I have business north of here. Ned assumed that meant that Bolton had planned to argue that as a bastard, John should not inherit and the castle should go to someone's second son, and Bolton would, no doubt, then sire a second son. Bolton stood, and Ned Stark stood with him. Safe travels, Ned said. Given the topic of their conversation, that felt particularly pointed. They both knew what was out there, what waited not only them but their children. And you, Lord Stark, Bolton said before he strode out of the solar. The man had come with no announcement or fanfare, and he left the same way. Chapter 9. Chapter text. Ned rode down the neck, surprised that the road was so firm and wide. All the travel between Winterfell and Castle Lionel had packed the dirt tightly and the horses' hooves had cleared the edges of vegetation. Horses coming, Jory said, bringing his mount up next to Ned. While the kingdom was at peace and thieves avoided the road near Castle Lionel, he still rested his hand on his sword. They were 20 strong with the Winterfell guards and servants, but anyone stupid enough to attack travelers this close to the castle would not be deterred by a few Winterfell guards. 2 destriers came trotting toward them. At first Ned thought a father and child, but no more than a minute later, the two passed through a patch of sunlight, and Ned recognized Jaime Lannister, meaning the short one was a young Tyrion. As Jaime closed the distance, his arrogant smirk was evident. Lannister, Ned said when they were close enough to hear each other. Stark, Jaime returned in the same tone. I thought we might join your group heading to the Eyrie. You're going to the Eyrie? The king called for us, Tyrion said. He was trying to sound nonchalant, but he was too callow to sound anything other than worried. We thought about ignoring it, but that felt like too much work. Jaime sighed and gave his brother a weary look. Robert wants you in the Eyrie. This worried Ned. He had assumed that Robert would ignore any complaints Tywin might make about having both his heirs in the north, but Ned felt Tywin's hand in this request. A flash of worry crossed Jaime's face, but then the smirk returned. Maybe the king wants some tips for upping his battle skills. I could design a few exercises for the training grounds. Maybe it would get him back in fighting shape. He pulled his horse around so he was even with Ned's beast while Jory fell back, ceding his spot to the higher-ranked man. After all, Tywin had not officially disowned his son, although he hadn't named him heir, either. Tyrion struggled to get his own massive beast to settle in behind them, next to Jory. Ned doubted that Robert would listen to anything Jaime suggested on the training grounds or off it. Worse, Jaime was privy to one of their most dangerous secrets, the presence of Arthur Dayne in the north. While Jaime had always been loyal to Dayne who had knighted him, he was also a fundamentally selfish man who had a history of betraying his morals to save his own skin. Ned had seen that in his visions of the future. I just want to see my brother win at a tourney, Tyrion said loudly, either to break the tension in the air or because he didn't recognize it. This Tyrion was 6 and 10, hardly old enough to have grown into the drunken, sharp-tongued advisor he became in Ned's last lifetime. Or maybe he was 7 and 10, but either way, he was not yet the man he would become. Jaime ignored him. I know my father probably requested this meeting. No doubt King Robert will offer concessions to the Lannisters if I will return home. Mayhaps my father is waiting at the end of this journey. He likely thinks he can purchase my favor and get me to return. He's wrong. Indeed. He's aiming at the wrong brother. I'm the one susceptible to bribes, Tyrion said. You are not, Jaime said without bothering to look at his brother. I truly am. After all, you took me away before I turned 10 and 4. I was always determined to buy a horse time at 10 and 4, and now I am in the north where horses are rare and expensive. Perhaps I could go back to being a Lannister long enough for one evening's entertainment. You wouldn't know what to do with a whore. Exactly. Tyrion exclaimed loudly. That's my point. I don't know what to do with a whore, so I would like to purchase one for the evening so she can teach me. But now I don't have the coin. I could be bribed. Jaime turned in the saddle to look at his little brother. So you'd turn me over to father for a whore? For the coin to hire a whore? I would never trade in human beings. The urge to play with words was something Tyrion had clearly learned young. The North has no sense of humor when it comes to slavery. Tyrion. Jaime sounded like an exasperated father. Had Ned spoken to Brandon that way, either Brandon or their father would have beat him soundly. And then they wondered why he was quiet. Fine, Tyrion said with an exaggerated sigh. I wouldn't sell you to father. I would just point him in your direction, take his coin, and then laugh when it didn't benefit him because you refused to listen. The sad thing is that he honestly doesn't understand why you're angry. All humor vanished from Jaime's face, and he turned deadly serious. He knows. He knows you're angry about the royal family, but he doesn't know why you're angry. It's strange how father's sympathy is limited to family. Father has no sympathy, even for family. Tyrion shrugged. He never had any for me, but I always assumed that was because I am a monster. Men have trouble empathizing with monsters. Jaime whirled his horse around, and Ned's own mount fought the bit and danced away at the sudden movement. Do not say that, Jaime snarled. That is father talking, and I don't want to hear his voice, not out of his mouth and not out of yours. Tyrion's eyes grew wide and he stared at his brother. The whole train had come to a halt, and Ned decided he was done with indulging the Lannister boys and their questionable manners. What does your brother mean by watching you in a tournament? Are you riding farther south after you speak with the king? Jaime held his brother pinned in his gaze for a few more minutes before giving Ned his full attention. He guided his horse back to the path before speaking. The king invited me to compete in the tournament at the Eyrie. I get the feeling that I will greatly disappoint the king if I do not, and I try to avoid disappointing kings. At least this one is less likely to burn you alive. Truly, Tyrion did not know how to avoid inserting himself into conversations that did not include him. Ned found he disliked the imp of Casterly Rock. Jaime snorted. If I am beheaded, I doubt I will care for the method of my death. King Robert would not behead a man for refusing a request, Ned said. I found kings do whatever the hell they please, Jaime returned. But then he took a deep breath. Forgive me, my lord. Being summoned makes me cross, but I had hoped we could ride together. If that is a bother, Tyrion and I can easily ride ahead. Ned imagined Jaime had seen the worst of kingship serving at King Aerys' side, and he probably hoped to remind Robert that he now worked for Ned's brother. He might even ask for Ned's protection, although he was the sort of man that had too much arrogance to ask for help. You can ride with us since we're all going to the same place, although I had been told this was a hunting party for a small number of people. Imagine that. King's lie, Tyrion said. Ned pressed his lips together, and Jaime turned around in the saddle. Tyrion, this would be the perfect time to shut up. Right. Sorry. Abject fear makes all the words spill out of my mouth before I can think about whether I should say them. I dislike how you suggest that Robert would do either of you harm after inviting you to the tournament. Ned didn't say that he was equally aggravated that Robert had lied to him to get him to come to the Eyrie. He would have words with Robert over that. It's not the king I worry about as much as his wife, Tyrion said. Ned frowned at Jaime, confused. My sister hates Tyrion. She and father both have some irrational belief that he carries the blame for my mother dying. My mother died birthing Benjen. Women die. The birthing bed is their battleground, and not everyone survives a battle. Ned thought of Lyanna lying on red-stained sheets, her face pale. She'd survived 3 days after that, but she'd never actually recovered. The birthing fever was like a battlefield wound that refused to heal even after the war was won. Yes, Tyrion said, but the rest of my family feels that they traded in a beautiful, kind Lannister and in return they got me. Now beautiful Lannisters are so common that their value is diminished by the ease of finding one. But a kind Lannister, that is a rare gem. And in being born, I destroyed that treasure that my father valued above all. He will never forgive me for that. Do not think yourself so special in earning his disdain. I am father's favorite, and he calls me the stupid Lannister. Were you born perfect, he would find another reason to call you inferior. Ned greatly questioned the parenting skills of Tywin Lannister. I will seek you out before I return north. We will ride together. Jaime, we should talk in private. Ned urged his horse into a trot, trusting Lannister to follow. Howland will be on the road up ahead of us. He is coming as well, Jaime said when he settled his horse next to Ned's on the trail. It was odd that Lannister would say as much. If you have some confession to make before Howland reveals something, now is the time to make it. Jaime snorted. You are a hard man, Lord Stark, and I grew up with Tywin Lannister. I have done nothing to earn your ire, and Howland will not say anything that casts me in a bad light. Good. Ned collected his thoughts. Lannister was a touchy man and he did not want to imply that he would betray that man who had knighted him, but Ned could not walk into a meeting with Robert without having some reassurances. You don't like me much. Have I done something to personally? Jaime asked before Ned could find the right words. Do you hate me because my father? Or do you hate me because I was such a great fool that it never occurred to me that my father would order the murder of children? The loathing in his voice when he said the last convinced Ned that Jaime would never return to his father. If Tywin Lannister thought gold would earn him his son's obedience, he was a fool. Ned wondered how Jaime had buried his feelings in the last lifetime. In his first life, Jaime Lannister had stabbed him in the leg, making it impossible for him to defend his household when that incestuous horror of a sister had them attacked. He wanted to say that he hated Lannister for fathering Joffrey and never doing a damn thing to stop his son's sadistic tendencies. He wanted to say that he hated Lannister for watching Brandon and Rickard Stark die. But some of those events happened in a world that didn't exist and never had, not anymore. And others had been beyond Jaime's control. I distrust you because you were in the North for 3 years and I knew nothing of it. An honorable man would have come to me. Jaime looked surprised. I was coming to you. After what my father did, I would be damned to the 7 hells before I would leave myself or my brother at his mercy, and you were the one man that I believed would stand up to my father and survive. Ned found that ironic considering that in his first lifetime he'd not even survived Cersei's plots, much less her father's. Ned had been an idiot, but he supposed he had improved if Jaime Lannister ranked him a survivor now. I assume finding Arthur Dayne here changed that. It did, Jaime said. I still wanted to come find you, but Arden said that you needed to be able to tell the king or my father or anyone else who asked that you had not seen us. At the time Tyrion was still 10 and 3. My father could have forced him to return home, and he would have used Tyrion to control me. And you had seen me defend children, Ned said softly. Tyrion is not a child. He never was one, really. Father hates him for being born, but my father also knows my nature. He knows how to make use of me the way another man would use a knife. It is only appropriate that you understand the tool my father will use to try to force me back to his side. Ned studied the man. The safest course of action would be to kill him before he could return to his father and betray their secrets, but Ned refused to be the sort of lord that treated the lives of those under him as tools. That was more Lord Bolton and it was definitely Lord Lannister, and Ned held little regard for either. And what is it that you thought I should know? They rode in silence for a time, the horses stamping on the hard ground and buckles jangling as they rode. It is not an easy thing to say, Jaime finally said. I suppose every man likes to see the best in himself, but Arden has always had the ability to force me to be more honest than I would like to be. Arthur's assumed name flowed off Lannister's tongue easily enough, but he said the name with such fond affection and admiration that Ned feared anyone who had heard Lannister speak of Arthur Dayne would see the similarities. Or perhaps they would dismiss the thought since Ned had told Robert that he had engaged Arthur at the Tower of Joy, defeating him. When Jaime spoke, the words felt heavy, as if he was a man confessing to the gods under a weirwood tree. When I was born, I came from the womb holding my sister's foot. She always used that as evidence that we were meant to be together. She used it as evidence that I was designed to follow. I devoted myself to swordplay first because it was one place that Cersei could not command me and my lord father did not excel. He prefers to hire men to swing swords for him. Your swordsmanship is admired throughout the north. The northern lords speak well of the skills you have imparted to those you train. Jaime nodded, his gaze off in the distance. 3 years ago when I came north, I believed that you would protect Tyrion when others would not. I did not admit the truth to myself until after Arden had beat me about the ears often enough to force me to listen. I came to you. My father likes to call me the stupid Lannister, but I am not. Battlefield strategy requires a sharpness of thoughts that belies my father's words. But I am the inconstant Lannister. My sister has always been cruel. I suspect she killed one of her friends when they were children, but when I am with her, actions no longer seem as unthinkable. When I am with my father, I begin to see lives as chess pieces to be moved about the board. I don't like myself when I am with them. One of the reasons I worked so hard to become a knight is because I wanted to spend my time with knights so that I might be the sort of person I admired. And then I found they are as selfish, cruel, and bloodthirsty as any other man. A title does not change a person's nature, Ned said softly. He could see these words hurt Jaime to confess. No man wanted to believe he was the dross tossed from the forge. He wanted to see himself as the sword strong, firm, constant and capable. Even the knife that had infected Ned during his first life was a minor flaw compared to what Jaime was confessing. Jaime's laugh was dark and cutting. No, it does not. My father would be as cruel without his titles, but perhaps he would be less free to visit those cruelties onto others. What Arden made me realize is that I came north because of you. The North has an inflexibility in its moral code that makes me feel as if the flaws I carry are no longer as significant. And that is why you do not have to worry about what I will say to King Robert when he demands my presence. I do not understand how your unflattering assessment of your own personality should be a reassurance to me. Jaime looked at him, and all the pain vanished under an arrogant smirk. It's simple. I like who I am when I'm in the North, when I have Arden to force me to see truths. When I have Tyrion with his sharp tongue and his jokes that hide warnings when I start to fall from the path. When I have men of the North around me, hard men who see winter and death as their true enemies and who lack the time to plot and scheme against others. I will never betray the North because if I return to King's Landing or Casterly Rock, I know who I will become. That is not who I want to be. A man's soul is his own, Ned chided him. No matter where you go, you choose the code you will follow. Winter is coming. That is my code. I have an obligation to my family, to my people, to the entire North to make sure that I am prepared to defend them. I cannot slack in that, and every decision I make is guided by my family's words. It doesn't matter whether I am in Dorne or Winterfell. The arrogance slipped, leaving behind something more, wistful perhaps. I hope I will be able to say that one day. But that day is not yet, and so I will stand with the North now for selfish reasons so that I can remain the Jaime Lannister who men respect. Even when they call me the Mad Kingsguard, they respect that I stood up to my father over his cruelty. I want to continue to be that man. Jaime kicked his horse's sides and sent him into a gallop. They were close enough to Castle Lyanna that he was in no true danger from bandits, so Ned watched him go. As a father, Ned had seen the phase that Jaime described. Robb had been all grace and manners around Cat, and a wild child of the North on the training field with him. In this life, Sansa followed suit, changing when she moved from the archery range to the governess's hall. Jon was much more ebullient around Benjen and became quiet around Cat. It was the nature of a child to try on different personalities and explore their identities. Of all his children, Arya was the only one to remain the same in every company, and she was more wolf or wilderling than little girl. Cat might blame that on Jon's influence, but she was wrong. But children moved past all that. They found themselves. They became individuals who did not bend to the will of others. Even Sansa, his little girl who had struggled the most to find herself in his first life, had done it. When pretending to be Littlefinger's illegitimate daughter, she had finally discovered who Sansa Stark was and who she wanted to be. Yet if Jaime spoke truth, and his words had the sound of an unpleasant truth, a man confessed against his own will, then he had never grown past this childish stage. Ned had never before seen the Kingslayer as a boy who still struggled to find himself, but perhaps that was one more way in which Ned had failed to see the truth in front of him. However, given this new information, and knowing what he did of Cersei, Ned had even more questions about Tywin Lannister's parenting skills. Apparently the only child to turn out normal was the one he ignored, and normal in Tyrion's case had included being a drunken whoremonger. Hopefully the North would have just as much of a positive influence on the imp. Chapter 10, The Nature of Destiny. Chapter text. Howland joined them on the road with 50 swordsmen. Apparently the king had ordered a huge shipment of blood-poisoning powder for the tournament. Everyone in the 7 kingdoms had known this was the largest tournament of the year. Everyone except Ned. He was exceptionally annoyed. He hated crowds, but he had very little choice when the king was expecting him. He was just thankful that the Lannister boys decided to ride near the back of the caravan. Ned understood Jaime and Tyrion better now, and he had some faith that Jaime would protect the North's secrets. However, he didn't like either Lannister boy. Howland recognized his mood and allowed Ned to brood as they moved down the King's Road. After they made camp for the night, Ned walked past Howland and said, "Walk with me," before grabbing a firebrand as he passed the closest fire. Howland had the audacity to look amused as he got up and followed Ned into the dark. As soon as the light from the guards' fires faded, Howland took lead, taking them off the path. "I'm sorry I couldn't warn you," Howland said. "I only learned King Robert had invited them when they showed up in the courtyard to saddle their horses." Ned rubbed his hand over his face. "I didn't even know it was a tourney I had been invited to. The Lannisters are the least of the secrets people have been keeping." Howland chose a fallen log and settled on it with ease. Ned would be afraid of some creature biting his rump, but Howland didn't seem concerned. "I know Jaime. He will keep our secrets." "We're betting our lives on that," Ned pointed out. One word. Even one careless word from Jaime would set the other 6 kingdoms against them. Ned jammed the unlit end of the brand into the heavy dirt. It cast shadows up into the trees so they appeared alive and staring down at the 2 people who dared to invade their territory. "I am," Howland said calmly. He idolizes Arden, and Arden is a good enough judge of character to take care of Jaime if he were a problem. It wasn't that easy to kill someone, especially when you were the one who had knighted him and watched him grow from a green boy to one of the greatest swords in the 7 kingdoms. However, Jaime's loyalties were less a mystery to Ned than the vicissitudes of history, or rather the lack of changes in most people. "Do you know what I don't understand?" Howland tilted his head to the side. "There are many things I do not understand, but I would not hazard a guess as to which of those you would also claim ignorance of. Why do my visions let me save some people and not others?" Ned frowned at the end of the fallen trunk. He would like to sit, but unlike Howland, he did not trust the more venomous wildlife to avoid him. "I assume you mean Jaime. Was he so terrible in your visions?" Ned snorted. "Yes. He attacked me in the streets of King's Landing to hide the fact that his sister had birthed his bastards." Howland grimaced. "He attacked Bran when my little boy saw him and his sister together, and I would have killed him the moment I set eyes on him, only I also saw him fighting at Jon's side, never yielding even when the dead overwhelmed the walls of Winterfell. And now he trains men for the North and has a reputation for protecting young maidens and small folk when he rides the King's Road. It's really quite galling how in this lifetime he has managed to improve his circumstances so significantly when I did very little to change the course of his life." Ned had convinced Jaime to go with him to search for the royal family, but after that day in King's Landing, he had ignored the existence of Jaime Lannister. "The old gods offer visions so we can change fate." "But why him? I have tried to change so many fates. I tried talking to Robert about fiscal responsibility and running a kingdom, but from what I've heard, he is still driving the crown into debt. I tried to warn him against the Lannisters, and yet he is still married to the poisonous Cersei. I tried getting him to speak strongly against killing babes, and yet Rhaegar's children are still dead and Robert still dishonored himself by making japes when he saw their bodies. I would have chosen to change Robert's fate before Jaime Lannister, and yet I have not been given that choice." Howland studied him for long minutes. "You have never quite forgiven him for the children's deaths, have you?" Ned rubbed a hand over his face. "I told him that he should publicly speak out and offer safety to Elia Martell and her children. When I could not get him to do so by appealing to his honor, I asked him to think about how he wanted his reign to begin. I told him that killing King Aerys would make people see him as strong, but offering protection to a woman and her children would make him just. But no matter what words I chose, I could not get Robert to change his path." "Did you truly believe you could get him to change?" Ned grimaced. The reality that he would never confess to anyone was that he had made plans to spirit Princess Elia and her children out of King's Landing. It's why he had sent men to protect the family. He'd only needed to slow Tywin Lannister's butchers so he could save the family. Ned had been willing to risk the wrath of Robert. There was something soul-crushing about seeing your friend, a man you thought of as a brother, speak dismissively of the tortured bodies of 2 children. Seeing Robert act so dishonorably the first time had gutted him, but seeing it happen the second when he could not lie to himself and tell himself that Robert had simply acted impetuously had damaged something far deeper. In this lifetime, Ned was trying to maintain a better friendship, but if anything, his feelings toward Robert were even darker. You resent the gods for creating an easier pathway to saving Jaime than Robert. Howland said softly. Ned would never have phrased it such. He recognized the power of the ancient gods and acknowledged that they could act as they pleased. But, gods forgive him, he did. It's not just Robert. I tried to change Jon Arryn's fate, and yet he still married Lysa. I tried to change Lyanna's fate, and yet she still died. Ned closed his eyes for a moment as emotions swept through him. Lyanna chose her battlefield. To take away her death would have been to take away her battle, and she was not willing to give you that power. She never was. Ned agreed softly. His sister had inherited enough stark stubbornness for 5 generations, but there was a part of him that would never forgive her for being willing to die. Did you truly try to stop the marriage between Jon Arryn and Lysa? Howland sounded shocked. I did. I told him that young women could grow resentful and even lecherous when they were married to men that had not the youth or time to entertain their dreams of romance. And what did he say? That Holster Tully was a good man who would raise dutiful daughters, and that Lysa would be happy in her marriage to him. However, I noticed that after his wedding he grew quieter around me. Ned knew Petyr Baelish's boasts that he had taken Catelyn's maidenhead were lies. He greatly suspected that was not true of Lysa. Both her sanity and her honor were tainted. I believe you've answered your own question, Howland said. Why do you say that? Howland brought a foot up to rest on the opposite knee. Lysa does not want to improve. Jon Arryn does not want to admit that a woman might be displeased with him as a husband. Robert does not want to put others' needs ahead of his own or even judge a woman by anything other than her beauty. While Ned understood what Howland was saying, he had trouble believing the man was right. But you think Jaime Lannister wants to be a better man when apparently all other men in the 7 Kingdoms are happy wallowing in their flaws? I think, Howland said in a sharp tone, that Jaime is a man balanced on the tip of an arrow. I've trained with him. I have even been with him when he has threatened dishonorable men with rather creative punishments if they do not respect the small folk. And I have also seen his arrogance. I have seen how defensive he gets when challenged and how petty he can be. Perhaps he is easier to save because he is balanced, so it takes very little effort to push him from one part of his nature to another. Ned considered Howland's words. Robert is a great ox of a man who will be neither physically nor emotionally pushed from where he chooses to stand, he said slowly. Just so. Perhaps that even speaks to the nature of your dreams. Ned gave Howland a curious look. What do you mean by that? I mean only that most green seers receive flashes, disconnected images that hint at a future that might be. Our people say that the only clear vision a green seer receives is that of his own death. Have you seen your own death? Ned shivered as the feeling of steel slicing into his neck ran through him. It hadn't even been a painful sensation. Ice was too sharp to create pain, which happened with the sharpest of swords. It was one reason why Ned always insisted on carrying out any executions that he ordered. A man who was condemned to die did not also deserve to suffer, and having been beheaded by his own sword, he could say in truth that the sensation was more of chill and shock and an odd sort of dizziness, as if the world upended itself. A head without a body had a split second to feel that lack of balance that came with being separated. But there had not been physical pain. The pain came from seeing his little Sansa screaming for him and seeing the malicious glee in Joffrey's eyes, knowing his death had entertained that little monster. I can see the truth in your face. Is it not strange that one's death is the single clear image the gods provide? Howland unloosed a boot and pounded it until a pebble fell loose. Perhaps the gods have no choice. Perhaps it is only by seeing how we die that we realize that there is a path that we must either follow or avoid. In my case, I am avoiding that death with all my might. I believe most men would avoid death, but I am surprised to hear you speak so passionately of preserving your life. Howland knew him too well, and Ned had revealed too many truths to him already. The man's quiet nature belied his sharp mind, and now he studied Ned closely. It is not my life I seek to preserve. It is my family. The mistakes I saw myself make. The majority of the consequences were borne by my children, not by I. Howland's expression turned somber. Then I am glad the gods have provided this vision. But I notice that the gods have also provided you with far more detail than most green seers receive. Perhaps you yourself are stubborn enough that, like King Robert, you require significant effort to push onto a new course. My people have a theory that green seers require both the magic of the blood that allows them to connect to the gods, magic which Starks possess, but also a duality of nature. They must be capable of both great decisiveness and great sloth. Or they require an ability to be both selfless and selfish. They must ride upon the point of an arrow that is delicate enough for the gods to push them. Howland held up his two hands, palms together, and tilted them from side to demonstrate. You lack that nature, Ned Stark, but perhaps that is why the gods have given you such a push. Jaime Lannister was certainly capable of great evil. He had pushed Bran from the tower and slept with his own sister, cuckolding the king in his own house. But he had also stood with Jon in the face of unspeakable horrors. If Howland was right, Jaime was poised on an arrow tip and easy to push from one part of his nature to another. He had called himself the inconstant Lannister, so it was possible. Ned could see that same duality in Bran, who had become a great seer in his other life. He could be a sweet child one moment, promising to never climb the walls again with such sincerity that Ned had believed him, and then scaling the exterior wall and cackling in glee when Catelyn yelled at him to return to the ground. In some ways, he had been more infuriating to raise than even Arya. Even when you provide answers that I do not particularly like, you always offer wise counsel. Thank you. We are friends, Ned. I hope I can always provide you with such counsel. Ned smiled, but he also felt a little guilty that in his first life had lost contact with Howland. In his first life, he had lost contact with all his friends, his true ones as well as the ones he now clung to in the hopes that he could navigate the Game of Thrones even if he never wanted to win it. But he was better this life. He was older and wiser, and this time he had not spent years learning to handle accounts that he had barely understood. Perhaps his own stubborn nature had required the gods to apply great force to change him, but he was changed, and he would make different choices. He now understood how others played the game, and he would not be outmaneuvered on the political field any more than on the battlefield. Come, Ned said as he pulled the dying brand from the ground. It gave barely enough light to illuminate the trunks of the trees. We should head back to the others. Howland pulled his boot back on and stood. After you, my lord. Chapter 11. Chapter text. Crown servants guided Ned to the main hall of the Eyrie where the king had set up court, although only Robert and two servants were waiting for him in the cavernous room. Two ornate chairs were set up at one end of the hall, but Robert was at the opposite end at a long table loaded with fruits and baked treats. Robert, Ned said. I had thought we were meeting for a hunt. I didn't expect to find a full tourney. Robert lifted a mug of ale in his direction. And if you knew it was a tourney, you would have avoided me. If my wife knew it was a tourney, she would have insisted on coming. Those sound like two good reasons to avoid telling anyone. Come. Sit. He gestured toward the chair next to his. Instead, Ned left an empty chair between him and the king, sitting far enough away to avoid his immediate reach. Ned wasn't sure when he had started thinking of Robert as someone to defend himself against. Robert pointed to the two serving boys hovering near the sideboard. You get out, he ordered. Then he pointed at the unfamiliar king's guard just inside the door. You, too. Guard from outside. Your Grace, the king's guard said in protest. I'm the king, and I am ordering you to get out. I'm safer with Ned than anyone else in the Seven Kingdoms, so get out before I rip that white cloak off your back and shove it up your ass. Ned's eyebrows rose in alarm, and the king's guard fled. You look like someone just pissed in your ale, Robert said. I am a little shocked at how you spoke to your men, your grace. Men. Robert harumphed. Real men don't stand around with their hands on their swords looking pretty. I don't have one Kingsguard that I would put in the tourney and trust to win it for me. He upended his tankard of ale. Then why are they Kingsguard? Robert slammed the tankard down on the table. Because their families are wealthy, or because we owe them for rising with us in the rebellion? Gods above. I don't even know why some of them were appointed, but John Arryn insists that they were all good solid choices. Robert raised his empty mug as if toasting to these paragons of knightliness who served him. When you yielded the throne to me so easily, I thought I was getting the better end of the deal. I'm starting to think you were the wise one, Ned. Are you not happy being king? Gods no. Being king is a miserable, thankless job with dickless men nattering in my ear about what they want. You're the only man I know who sends me ravens complaining as one man might do to another without seeking gold or privileges that only I can grant as the king. It's tiresome. Robert studied Ned. Why didn't you take the throne? I had not the lineage for it, your grace. Ned didn't dare mention Robert's Targaryen grandmother, but the fact was that Westeros was used to a Targaryen royal family, and Robert could at least give them the illusion of it. Robert snorted. Don't give me that. Stark's working of winter long before the other great families had figured out how to slap together a mud house to live in. I believe that is a slight exaggeration. It's not much of one. You had as much right to the throne as I, maybe more given that you got to it first. But I was not trained to lead the Seven Kingdoms, Ned said honestly. I was not even trained to lead the North, not well enough. I struggled to figure out how to put my own house right, so I could not have handled the job you have undertaken. At least I had Stannis. He's a joyless cunt, but he can handle a kingdom's books. Robert gave him a sly look. You have to ride herd on a younger brother who is fathering bastards at 4 and 10. That one is another Brandon. Robert raised his ale as though toasting Benjen and his sexual conquests. My grace, he is not. Having his paramour appear in Winterfell with a babe was enough to cool his tempers. These days he focuses far more on Castle Lionel, and he says he will not take a wife for fear that any woman would ask him to set Jon aside as heir. He is very fond of his son. Mayhap, but Castle Lionel is the very subject I wanted to bring up with you. Oh. Ned hid his discomfort. He did not want Robert taking an interest in Jon. The castle is near half finished. When it is done, I would happily offer you a tourney there, but I'm afraid that Castle Lionel does not have much land that would be appropriate. Crops grow well in the flooded and muddy ground between the two rivers, but a joust on the same land would end with horses breaking legs. Despite the fact that you call the castle only half finished, you have significant troop movement there. I do not, your grace, but Ben has landed on a rather profitable scheme given that he has limited resources. Robert snorted. Cut the crap, Ned. You gave Benjen a castle that sits on the only source of the blood-cleansing powders. Your brother will be richer than both of us within a generation. His choice to hire Jaime Lannister and train tens of thousands of troops is not one motivated by gold. For right now, it is, Ned said firmly. The blood-cleansing powder is a limited resource. Unless the Crannog men wish to harvest the flower to extinction, they can take very little of it from the marshlands at a time, and it is expensive to tend and harvest. And I have already told you that I am committing all of my gold to building on the west coast. Bear Island has been isolated in their fight against the Ironborn for far too long, and the whales off our coast are too great of a resource for us to neglect when winter is coming. If Ben wants to fit his castle with anything more than the most utilitarian of fittings, then he must come up with his own gold. And if his scheme results in the North being the best trained army in the Seven Kingdoms. Robert's voice was dangerously low. In Ned's first life, he had never feared Robert, not when Robert yelled or threatened or blustered. But now he felt the dull ache of it in his bones. While Ned had made too many mistakes by not playing the Game of Thrones in his first life, in this one, his own moves made every interaction more unpleasant. It turned every conversation into a struggle for supremacy. Someone has led you to worry about what a well-armed North looks like. They must have, because you know it only benefits you. The Ironborn grow bolder and the wildlings are reproducing at an unprecedented rate and pressing hard on my northernmost lords. The Umbers are losing livestock each moon, and some landholders have had their larders raided and their daughters stolen. So yes, I do wish for a well-armed and trained North. Who is whispering that you ought to worry? King Robert took a swig of ale, but something tight and coiled seemed to loosen. Ned might be working harder this lifetime to tend his friendship with Robert, but someone else was working hard to undermine it. "My lovely wife," Robert said in a disgusted tone. "The woman natters on incessantly about how dangerous you could be if you put your mind to it. Robert, you know as well as I do that Cersei does not care about my army, or yours. That woman cares about naught but wine. I should know, I'm married to her poisonous cunt. That is no way to speak of your wife and queen. Besides, she is the mother of your children." That silenced Robert for a short time. He stared at his mug as though fascinated by the color. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Myrcella is a nice enough girl, but I don't think her mother has looked at her more than a dozen times in her life, and Joffrey. Cersei loves the boy. He is the sort of boy that only a mother could love." Robert sounded disgusted. Ned clamped down on a deep-set revulsion that struck him when he heard the name Joffrey. He had hoped that Robert would have been spared that disgusting child, but Ned, that fate was capricious and often determined to follow its own course. He wondered who had fathered Joffrey this time, because Jaime would rather burn King's Landing to the ground than return to the city and bed his sister. "I believe Tywin is encouraging your wife. I might have heard one or two things about how furious he is that you are preventing his heir from returning home." Ned snorted. Of course Tywin would cast himself as the injured party who was owed some recompense. In all the Seven Kingdoms there was not a more selfish man than Tywin Lannister. "I am doing nothing. And the only thing that Benjen is preventing is Jaime Lannister becoming a kinslayer. His father ordered the murderers of the children and the women he hoped to guard. Lannisters like to say that they pay their debts, and I believe that Jaime sees his father as owing a rather significant one. The man was ordered to guard King Aerys, yet he put a sword through the king's back. Forgive me if I don't take Jaime Lannister's oaths very seriously. There is a reason he's called an oath-breaker and became the first man ever dismissed from the Kingsguard." Robert seemed disinterested in continuing their discussion of the North's training regime, which was far better than having him overly involved. Ned was painfully aware of the fact that Castle Lyanna was further south than he would like Jon to be. He felt exposed, but he also knew that Jon wanted to be with Benjen and away from Catelyn. Ned felt an obligation to give him a happier life this time around. "Considering your description of your current Kingsguard and their talents, perhaps you should rethink the policy and dismiss a few more." Robert laughed. "Don't think I haven't considered it. But it's different in the capital, Ned. Every move has to be carefully balanced. A man can't even take a piss in the morning without thinking about whether the direction he aims will offend one house or another. I never thought you'd be one to care about the politics of King's Landing." "Oh, I don't. But my current problem is that when Tywin Lannister is unhappy, he threatens to call in certain debts that the crown is ill-placed to repay." Ned sucked air through his front teeth. "He hopes to force you to force me to order my brother to dismiss Jaime Lannister. That appears the sum of it, yes. And the crown's debts to him are enough to force the issue." Robert sagged in his chair. "Jon Arryn wouldn't even let me throw my own tournament. He says with Tywin Lannister calling the debts due, I have not the money for it." Robert looked at mournful as a child denied a treat at the end of dinner. He was a man grown, and still he acted as he had when they'd been boys in Jon Arryn's house. But he had improved. In his last lifetime, Ned distinctly remembered Robert throwing tournaments for several more years. He'd thrown one when Ned became the Hand of the King, and the year previous he had thrown an enormous one to celebrate Joffrey's name day. As much as fate tried to force events down the same course, it was also changing. Maybe Robert was learning some hard truths early enough to change his course. The crown should not be dependent on one part of the kingdom for its coffers, Ned advised. "True, but I've cancelled part of the taxes for the Stormlands, the Vale, and the Westerlands to compensate them for the losses they took in the war. The Reach, Dorne, and Driftmark and the other traitors in the Blackwater Bay are not sending enough to make up for the missing income." Cold fury washed through Ned's veins. Maybe in the last lifetime Ned had been too much out of sight. After all, Ned had avoided Robert in order to keep Jon away from prying eyes, but this time he had intentionally maintained their friendship through ravens and through longer letters carried by messengers. Yet, Robert spoke blithely of the losses other kingdoms suffered and the ways in which he had tried to repay them for their loyalty. And the North. Ned asked, holding his temper with sheer force of will. What about it? The North fought for you to a man. Every house in the North rose with your banners. We were not the Stormlands where each lord decided whether or not to stand for you. We were not like the Westerlands that waited until the war was near over to march. The North sent every man it could spare to put you on the throne, and what have you offered us? Robert looked stunned for a moment. The North doesn't trade in favors, he finally said with a hint of anger. Isn't that what you always told me? That the North didn't play these kinds of Southern games? Because we expect people to treat us fairly. If you trade favors to one kingdom because they have stood by your side, then you should offer the same favors to all kingdoms that stood by your side. Robert was getting red on his neck and chest. Jon Arryn tells me that I can barely afford to keep the crown together now, and you want me to give more favors. I don't want you to give any favors that you cannot afford, but if you cannot afford to offer forgiveness on taxes to everyone who stood at your side, then you cannot afford to offer that benefit to some. Robert slapped his hand down on the table hard enough that an apple fell from the bowl and rolled about on the table. I gave them my word that their bannermen would not suffer because they marched with me. So you leave my bannermen to suffer in their stead. We are paying more taxes than we ever have. Because you have more wealth than you ever have. The blood cleansing powder is sending gold rolling into your coffers. We do not see the profits from it that you seem to think. I have explained to all that it is difficult and expensive to harvest. Ned's own temper was rising to match Robert's. Had the king been this annoying in their previous life? And yet you have enough profit to build a new castle, Robert countered. Ned had never seen the man so red unless he was swinging a warhammer or deep in his cups. Profits my family has been saving for generations. Do you really think so little of the North, so little of me, that you offer us nothing when you give away the riches at your table to everyone else? No. Robert knocked over a jug of ale and the amber liquid ran across the wood, seeping into the seams. His anger seemed to leach away with the spilled ale. No, of course I don't. By the gods, Ned, I don't know how to lead. I don't know how to be king, and while it may be unfair that I've allowed you to carry more than a fair share of the kingdom's debts, I did not think that you would protest. You are doing so well that it seemed that I could ask this of you without it being unfair. There was an edge of hurt in Robert's voice now, and all of Ned's anger fled. When they had been boys together, Ned had always thought of Robert as being an overly affectionate hound. He loved people, perhaps he loved women too much, and he bounced from one moment of excitement to another, seemingly never noticing when he knocked things over or left to destruction in his wake. Robert had never intended harm even when he managed to rain destruction on his own friends. Ned had continued to think of his friend that way until the rebellion. It was only then that he truly considered Robert a dangerous man. It was only when Robert had failed to see the humanity in dead children that Ned saw the real danger. He didn't know whether this current burst of temper was harmless enthusiasm and poorly directed energy or deadly danger. We can figure this out together, Your Grace, Ned said calmly, but my bannermen will be less than pleased if they find out that they are paying more in taxes than Tywin Lannister, who refused to march until the war was won and even then distinguished himself only by ordering the brutal deaths of children. Robert rubbed his face and stared at the spilled ale sadly. Enough with complaints about the dragon spawn, Robert said. I agree that they ought not to have died as they did, but Tywin was right that those children would have been a rallying point for the Reach and half the realm. I will not apologize for agreeing with him. And I will not apologize for saying that my bannermen should not pay more in taxes than those who could not stir from their castles long enough to fight. Robert had the grace to flinch. Fair enough. Can I assume that you are not going to ask your brother to fire Jaime Lannister? I am not. I dislike the man, but my brother's scheme has proven wise. He is bringing in a fair profit by training men, and my bannermen are better able to repel the wildlings that are now invading the north with such regularity that they pose a legitimate threat to the safety of our northern families. I thought you had a great wall to protect you from your barbarians. A great wall means nothing when the people on the other side have learned to scale it, and there are not enough men to fill the castles. It is the obligation of all 7 kingdoms to man those towers, and yet we have at best a smattering of convicted murderers and rapists serving under the command of Northmen who do still see service as an honor. Yet another problem, and one I cannot do aught about. I find that as king my powers are rather more limited than I had anticipated, and I certainly cannot get lords to care about the war. That appears to be a rather northern concern, Robert said. It ought not to be. Ned kept his voice low. If he could get Robert's help, perhaps they could better prepare for what was to come. Dragons were creatures of magic. It is said that they were not able to cross the wall when they flew north. The dragons are gone, Robert said. Ned nodded. But my ancestors built a wall that would stop a creature as great as a dragon, and then they named those who served at the wall the protectors of the realm of man. Does it not occur to you that there could be something akin to a dragon, something that could threaten the whole realm? Robert repeated. The dragons are gone. But what if the monsters north of the wall are not? Ned asked. Robert snorted. I am not drunk enough to discuss fairy tales, he said in an uncompromising tone. Ned had known Robert long enough to know when he had lost to the man's attention. Fine, but it is still true that my bannermen are struggling with wildlings to an extent never before seen. Since you are willing to give concessions to those kingdoms that served you well in the rebellion, perhaps we can reach an agreement on this. I have no extra funds to send you in the north, Robert said with an unhappy growl. If I cannot afford my Tonys, then I cannot afford your war. And you cannot afford the corruption and graft that appears rampant in your capital, either, Ned said. I asked the Lord Commander for an accounting, and the money I send you for the wall does not all reach it. Robert's attention was still elsewhere. Likely they pay the guards that take prisoners north or have some other costs associated with transportation to the wall, Robert said dismissively. I assume someone has to pay for bread along the way unless you want corpses delivered. Perhaps that is true in other kingdoms, but my lords take their men to the wall themselves. There are no guards to pay or fees to fund them on the road. There is no reason for one gold piece to vanish from my taxes before it reaches the wall, and yet it does. Gods, man, do you want me to track down every bit of corruption in the city? Robert's voice was rich with frustration. I would do nothing else with all my time. I admit that we need a new master of coin. Jonarin brought me a recommendation, someone he said is quite skilled at taking 2 gold pieces and turning them into 3. Your lady wife might know him, apparently he is called Littlefinger. Were men to call me that, I should take my hammer to them. Robert raised a fist to punctuate his words. I do know Littlefinger, Ned said, and he sent a quick prayer to the old gods that this was a point in history he could change. My wife would call him a sweet boy, but Brandon had a much different view. Brandon called him a grasping and greedy seeker of status who believed himself better than he was. He tried to fight Brandon for Caitlyn's hand in marriage when he had no family or wealth to back his claim. But apparently with Littlefinger, wanting something is the same as deserving it, and if anyone gets in his way, he sees them as enemy. Robert blinked at him, clearly shocked. Do you think so low of the man? I do. And all of Caitlyn's words about how sweet he is will not convince me otherwise, especially when there are other rumors. Ned had not heard the rumors in this lifetime, but in the previous one he had. Robert stared at him blankly. I know my lady wife, and I trust her. She was a maiden on our marriage night, of that I have no doubt, Ned said. But I have heard that Littlefinger not only enjoys whores and works them, taking a portion of the coin they earn on their backs, but also that when he is deep in his cups, he will claim to have taken the maiden heads of both Tully daughters. Robert sat up, his face a riot of fury. Jonarin has not heard this. He would not recommend the man if he had. Jonarin does not spend time where men drink or listen to those who do. But, as I say, I've only heard stories carried by those who heard from others. I cannot know the truth of it, but I will not trust a man who has these rumors circling about him, Ned said. He considered that if Robert didn't listen then Ned might need to arrange for the man's death. Arthur Dane had contacts in King's Landing, that much was obvious. Perhaps he would have the name of an assassin who could not be traced back to the north. Gods, Ned, all you bring me is more trouble. Then let me bring you some solutions. If you want a master of coin who is able to squeeze 4 gold dragons out of 2, appoint Lord Marndaly to your small council. The North has noticed that you did not honor us with any appointments, and this would ease that complaint, and at the same time, Lord Wyman Marndaly is honorable as a man can get. Other than a deep love for wine and feasting, which you will no doubt share with him, he has no sins that will infringe upon his ability to do his duty. Certainly there are no unseemly rumors with his name attached, and he has a son who can take over his duties. Willis. Robert looked thoughtful. Mandaily, you say? Aye, and I might be willing to voluntarily increase the taxes I would pay to the wall under two conditions. Robert pinned him with an unhappy glare. For someone who claims that the North does not trade in favors, you sound like one who is soon to do exactly that. Since I learned that you rewarded others and not my bannermen, perhaps I feel this is a battlefield I must enter for the sake of honor. Robert snorted. Go on, let me hear your conditions. First, I will deliver the gold to the wall myself. We will not go through the capital or risk having every person whose hand touches the pouch remove a coin for himself. Second, a Targaryen stole a large portion of land from my bannermen, the Umbers. I would have it returned to them. The gift, Robert said. Aye. The Targaryens hoped the wall would become self-sufficient, growing their own food. Apparently they forgot that growing food requires people, the one commodity that is rarest at the wall. So, you would favor one of your bannermen over all others. You just told me that a fair leader does not do that, Robert said. Sometimes he was annoyingly insightful. A fair leader talks to those involved and offers them a trade. Bolton and Umber will benefit from expanded territories. In return, they will devote more men to dealing with the Wilderling problem. Ned carefully did not define how they were to deal with the problem or what the problem was. No doubt King Robert did not want to hear that Ned needed to get everybody he could south of the wall to avoid leaving bodies that could be easily reanimated. And how much would you voluntarily increase these taxes? Robert asked. Ned pursed his lips. The fact was that few lords paramount were sending any significant measure of gold to the wall. While it was unfair to ask the North to shoulder the costs alone, Ned would not be able to convince anyone else to send money, nor could he afford to wait until the dead started to rise before addressing the problem. Hungry men and poorly tended weapons were crippling the brothers at the wall. How much have you reduced the taxes in the Westerlands? Ned asked. Robert rolled his eyes. Are you that offended by gold? I am, because it implies that you valued their involvement in the war more than mine or my bannermen's, and while I do not believe that was your intent, it is hard to not take offense at the reality. 20%. Ned nodded. Reduce my tax by 10%, and I will send an equal amount of coin plus half again to the wall in addition to my standard fees. The North will feel like you are honoring them, and the wall will get the coin it needs. And once the wall was well stocked with food and updated weapons, Ned could send some brothers to Flea Bottom. If the poor knew they would have food and if the brothers could pay a decent fee to the family of any man who chose service, they might be able to man the wall. Robert was studying him like Ned was a bug he found particularly curious. I've never known you to be so concerned about the wall. You've never known wildlings to come across the wall in such numbers that families are murdered in their beds and flocks decimated. Robert looked down, a small show of shame in a man who normally did not allow himself such feelings. I am sorry I did not know you're having such troubles. Ned nodded. My kingdom is mine to manage, Your Grace. And I am sorry I have spoken so out of turn. You are not the only one who feels stress at the obligation of leading. My father never raised me to be the Stark of Winterfell. Looking back, I believe he raised me to be a good and proper husband for some Southron lord who had a daughter but no son. That is an honorable pursuit for a second son, is it not? It is, but my father's plans did not take into consideration that fate and a mad king would steal both him and Brandon away before they could teach me the full measure of my duties. Like you, that leaves me struggling to fulfill the role I've been given. I have no doubt you're doing better than I just made an agreement to allow you to pay less taxes at the exact time that Jon Arryn is yelling that we are not bringing in enough in taxes. I am going to get another lecture over this. Robert gave him the same wry look they would give each other when they had caused trouble as children and they knew Jon was going to lecture them on honor and duty. Invite Lord Mandaily to the capital, Your Grace. He is very good at appearing affable while holding a knife to a man's neck. Perhaps Wyman will find a way to get those houses who are not paying their fair measure to pay. Does he hold some magical powers, or are you subscribing to the theory that Tywin Lannister shits gold and he won't mind shoveling some of that shit east to the capital? Robert asked. Ned smiled. In this second lifetime, he had spent more time traveling his kingdom and asking the other lords how they managed their lands. The first time around, Ned feared that doing so would have marked him as a green boy incapable of managing Winterfell, but now he knew that his determination to solve every problem alone had been the mark of an immature mind. And he had taken Robb with him so he would see more of ruling at a much younger age than even Brandon had. It meant he had heard more than one interesting story when Lord Marndale had feasted him. He once had a merchant who brought much trade to his docks. The merchant insisted that he pay less in dock fees or he would take all of his trade elsewhere. As a young man who feared losing trade, Wyman capitulated, and it was only years later that he realized the unfairness of it. Another merchant learned that there were different sets of fees and this new merchant too threatened to stop trading if he did not get reduced prices. Robert leaned forward, finally interested. What did he do? Ned smiled. If a man is paying less for his dock fees, then is it not appropriate that he receives fewer services? The merchant who was paying less would be told that all the warehouses were full for 3 days, trapping him in the city with no way to offload as others received preferential treatment. The first merchant ships were detoured to docks that were rotting. When his sailors were taken by the town's guard for drunkenness, the captains would not be told for days. It appeared that the entire city was wildly inefficient with only the crews of that merchant who had taken advantage of Wyman in his youth. Robert laughed uproariously. I already like this Lord Marndale of yours more than the rest of my small council combined. Even Jon Arryn. Jon is the one who took my Tonys from me. He is the one I like least right now. Wyman is an efficient and clever man, although he laughs so loud and drinks so much that when you first meet him it is difficult to believe how efficient he is. Robert glowed. He appeared too happy. It appears you have brought me the perfect advisor. Had you offered me appointments, I could have found you advisors to suit you, Ned scolded. He felt so much older than Robert now, and part of him felt guilty that he wasn't doing more to help when Robert had no aptitude to lead. Peace, Robert said, holding his hand up. I had forgotten how disagreeable you could be when crossed. Perhaps I should remind you more often, Your Grace. Please don't, Robert said. This is supposed to be a good time. We get to watch the jousts and the melee. Boy, he bellowed at the top of his voice. Bring us ale. The door opened and the 2 serving boys scrambled in. Ned might still resent the things Robert had done in the first life and even the things he'd said in this one, but the truth was, he had missed his friend and he understood his struggles more now. And so he accepted the ale and enjoyed his time swapping stories of hunts and theories of who would win the tourney. Chapter 12. Chapter text. Jaime was proud of how well he'd done at the melee. 5 men had banded together to try and take him out of the competition, and he had removed 3 of them from the field. A 4th had been taken out by Aefrey, who took advantage of the fighter's distraction before being targeted himself. In the end, Jaime had come in 3rd overall, but no one else on the field had been targeted so fiercely, so he considered it a win. After his lackluster performance at the joust, he was glad that he could prove his mettle. After all, his success as a master at arms depended not on his gold or his name, but on his reputation as a fighting man. Jaime limped out of the Maestas tents, flexing his fingers to keep himself from scratching at the wound which was covered in the blood-poisoning powder on to prevent infection. Others did not complain of itching, but Jaime found it almost intolerable. Still, it was better than risking an infection. I thought you were supposed to win, Tyrion said. Jaime grinned at his little brother. If you would like to join the melee and show me how it's done, I would be happy to commission armor and a weapon for you, brother. The only weapon I wield is my tongue, and I find that it protects me just fine. One day, your tongue will get you in more trouble than those little legs can run away from. Was that clever? Are you trying to be clever? Who are you, and what have you done with my brother? Jaime Lannister. Tall, slightly thick-headed. Tyrion had an expression of exaggerated concern that did little to hide his good humor. Since they had fled the Westerlands, Tyrion had become far more open with his emotions. It was as if Tywin's inability to have human emotions had been slowly infecting Jaime's little brother. Leaving the Lannisters had been the best decision either of them had ever made. Jaime gave his brother a 2-fingered salute that made his brother grin madly, but then his expression froze. He was looking at a spot behind Jaime, and Jaime closed his eyes. He did not need Tyrion to tell him who was back there. Father Tyrion said in a voice as cold as a northern winter. How utterly and completely wonderful to see you. Lies do not become you, Tywine said. When Jaime turned, he was looking at Tyrion with disgust, as he usually did. No, I suppose lies are more your specialty, Tyrion said. When he'd been younger, he had always flinched when faced with his father's disdain, but now he stared back. Jaime felt uncomfortable standing between the two men, as if their mutual hatred were swords and he was in danger of being skewered. Leave us, Tywine said. Jaime scowled at his father. You don't get to send him away like he's a child who has overstayed his welcome at dinner. He is a child, but as for whether he has overstayed his welcome, I imagine Lord Stark would need to tell him that. I am sure the man would rather not have him in the north. Tywine would not even say Tyrion's name, and Jaime felt a cold fury rise up. He imagined the cold glare Lord Stark would have worn or the emotionless threat Arthur would have issued. But before Jaime could decide what to do, Tyrion stepped forward and put a hand on Jaime's forearm. It's fine. Despite what father thinks, we both know I've not worn out my welcome with Lord Stark or the North. I will go find him and coordinate our return to King's Landing. Jaime didn't want Tyrion to leave. First, Lord Stark was not fond of Tyrion, but more importantly, Jaime desperately wanted someone there as a buffer between himself and his father. But life rarely indulged him in his preferences. So he watched Tyrion walk away. Come, let us speak in my tent. Tywine gestured, and a Lannister squire rushed forward to gather the armor Jaime dangled from his hand. Without waiting to see if Jaime would follow, Tywine strode through the crowd. Part of Jaime wanted to act the part of the insolent child that his father always accused him of being and run the other way. It would have felt good in the moment, but his father would have simply tracked him down once more, and that was a humiliation Jaime did not want to suffer in front of Lord Stark. So gritting his teeth, he followed his father through the crowds that were beginning to disperse now that the last competition had ended. Men and women wandered the stalls choosing wares set out by craftsmen. Boys waved at Jaime or ran behind him at a distance just as Jaime had once run behind the knights he'd watched compete. And yet, all this normalcy faded as his attention focused on Tywine Lannister's retreating back. Jaime always knew he would have to face his father eventually, but he had spent years avoiding this moment. By the time he reached the tent, Tywine was already inside. A guard lifted the flap for Jaime, and he stepped inside without even having to bend over. Northern tents were built for survival. They were small so that the heat of a man's body would gather close to him, but this was a behemoth. Fabric walls within the structure divided the space into rooms, and braziers were lit to hold off the mild chill in the air. His father sat at a small round table and sipped wine with all the arrogance Jaime remembered from his youth. Nothing in the world would ever convince Tywine Lannister that he had made a mistake. No, he was the perfect Lannister, the standard by which all other Lannisters should judge themselves and find themselves lacking, even when he was a terrible father and worse human being. Are you quite done playing sellsword? His father asked. Jaime plastered on his most arrogant smirk and chose the seat across from his father, ignoring the servant who poured a goblet of wine for him. I assure you, the North has no sellswords. They are far more concerned with honor than gold. Then they are fools. Honor is an illusion, but you have hired yourself out and you earn your pay through the use of your sword. What else would I call you other than a sellsword? Tywine's voice was rich with contempt. This was familiar. If they added in Cersei vying for their father's attention and Tyrion staring at his food in an attempt to avoid catching Tywine's eye, Jaime would feel like he had returned to his childhood. I don't know, Master-at-Arms sounds accurate. Yes, a Master-at-Arms for the younger and more useless Lord Stark and his bastard child. At least if you were in the employ of Lord Eddard Stark, you would be helping to improve strained relations between the North and the Westerlands, but you have to work for the younger Stark whose only accomplishment is fathering a bastard by the time he was 4 and 10. Your brother used to talk about trying to best the Stark record. Did he? Do you care? Jaime asked. In truth, he was surprised his father had asked about Tyrion at all. Of course. If a child lives, it is a bastard Lannister, and anyone who is a Lannister is my concern. Jaime wondered if this was his father's attempt to try to regain control over at least one of his sons. Actually, if Tyrion had fathered a bastard, it would be a Snow. And Snows are not seen as evil in the North. They are often sought out as mediators since they owe their allegiance to the North rather than a specific bannerman. Jaime leaned back and crossed one leg over the other, slouching to annoy his father more. How inexplicable that in the South where bastards are disrespected, they become bitter and hateful. In the North, where they are seen as the children of the land, they are honorable. It's almost as if people become whatever they are told they are. Jaime ran his finger along the brim of his goblet without bringing it to his mouth. He wouldn't put it beyond his father to slip sweet sleep or milk of poppy into his drink. He had no illusions about the lengths his father would go to in order to gain control of this situation. And Jaime was not a good enough man to hold out if Tywin brought the full force of his machinations against him. Jaime's best defense right now was hiding behind his admiration for the Stark family and the North, and reminding his father that the Westerlands might have an even more precarious relationship with the king's best friend if his father didn't tread carefully. I raised you to be my heir and to carry the Lannister name forward into the future. You have not become what I expected. The sad truth was that Jaime probably would have followed his father's plans had Tywin been around often enough to communicate his expectations. Jaime wondered if he would have been happier had he simply followed his father's path rather than scheming with Cersei. He certainly would not have been a better man. He plastered on a look of boredom calculated to annoy his father. Instead, I have chosen to be the greatly respected master-at-arms responsible for training most of the fighting forces of the North. And how interesting that is. Exactly why does the North feel such an obligation to train their men in war? Could it be that Ned Stark has entered the Game of Thrones? Jaime laughed. The thought of Ned politicking was enough to amuse him for days. Do you believe he would ever stand against his friend, King Robert? And yet I hear reports that the North is far more populated than it was even a year ago, and you have trained large numbers of men in the art of war. Why? Perhaps you should ask Lord Stark, Jaime said. This was not a conversation he wanted to have with his father. The man was far too dangerous to trust with information. I'm sure he would have an excuse worthy to tell his friend the king, Tywin said dryly. And given that this is Ned Stark, whatever he tells the king is the truth, Jaime said. His father studied him for a moment before he then laughed. You truly believe that? You have never stopped being the stupid Lannister who looks for men to be chivalrous and women to act the part of damsels in need of rescuing. How pathetic. Jaime wanted to rise to the occasion, to insult his father, to tell him that had Jaime's mother survived, she never would have allowed him to treat her children the way he had. But he knew that words were his father's battlefield, and this was simply his father's attempt to win the war. Jaime was too wise of a warrior to give his enemies such an advantage. You deal in lies and half-truths, Jaime said, thinking of how his father had confessed to sending men to secure the royal family while insisting that he had no idea that his own men would interpret that to mean killing them. It was a blatantly obvious lie, but one that allowed King Robert to dismiss the whole issue of the children's deaths the way he wanted to. After all, he had been the one to say that he saw only demon spawn, dragon spawn, and not babes. Not all men treat the truth with such disrespect. What do you want, father? I want you to return home and take up the mantle as my heir. I want you to learn to run Casterly Rock the way you should have been doing since before you and your sister conspired to get you on the Kingsguard for whatever inane reason you two plotted. Jaime schooled his face to hide the horror at the idea that his father may have been investigating why Cersei had wanted Jaime in the Kingsguard. Their father had been arranging a marriage between Prince Rhaegar and Cersei, and neither of them had ever seen their father fail at any endeavor. Cersei had been excited, but she had also been fearful of being without protection, of having to watch Jaime with another woman. If her scheme to get him in the Kingsguard had failed, Jaime suspected she would have convinced him to take the black. Back then he had been enough of a young idiot to go along with her schemes without thinking through the true consequences. I am no good with figures or records or the running of the keep. You have informed me of that enough times that I believe it true. So why would I leave a position in which I excel to live in your shadow and be reminded of my failures to learn my letters properly, my failure to do sums, my failure to perform most of a lord's duties? You are my son. You will learn to excel. We will find you a wife who is capable of ameliorating your flaws. Until then, you are fond of the North, and I hear the women are strong and well educated. Of course, I would prefer a Lord Paramount's daughter, and Sansa is a bit young. A betrothal with her would require you to wait at least 10 years for her to be of marriageable age, but perhaps some significant Bannerman has a daughter that is appropriately schooled in such matters. If not, no doubt I can find a Lannister cousin who will function admirably as Lady Lannister." His father spoke as if the matter was already settled and only the matter of an appropriate lady wife needed discussing. Jaime shivered at the idea of a cousin. He had laid with his own sister, and he was quite done fucking family members. Jaime would never again lay with a Lannister. Perhaps his father recognized the look of disgust on Jaime's face. "If none of your cousins appeal, then we shall search through major landholders and find a daughter who will. I understand the Westerlings have a girl who is quite pliable and good with her letters. She is still young and untrained, but we could foster her and raise her to be the wife you need." "I am not returning to the Westerlands," Jaime said firmly. Tywin's eyes narrowed, and his father projected an air of murderous fury. As a child, Jaime had not truly believed the stories of his father's atrocities. As a young man, he had excused them as the foolish actions of a boy who wanted to prove himself better than his own father. Now that he was a man, Jaime could see that his father was selfish and without empathy. It didn't matter what forces had shaped him that way, it only mattered who he was now. "You will return home," his father ordered. Jaime leaned back and lifted one leg to prop over the arm of the chair. It was an insolent move that had always angered his father in the past. "I assume you do not want to declare war on another Lord Paramount, especially not one with an army trained as well as the North is. So I will not be returning with you. And if Tyrion chooses to return with me, will you leave the brother that you love so much, that you killed Lannister guards to remove from my tender care?" Jaime slammed his feet down and leaned forward so fast that his father jumped. Jaime had never startled his father before, but maybe Tywin finally read something of the Lannister evil in Jaime's own eyes. "Tyrion would never return with you. If you try to convince me he wants to go to Casterly Rock, I will know that you have either forced or blackmailed him, and I will consider you an enemy who has attacked my family. And as you know, a Lannister always pays his debts." Jaime stared at his father, and his father stared back. For the first time in his life, Jaime felt equal to his father. Tywin blinked and lifted his wine to his lips, taking only the barest sip before he continued. "Your sister is also your family. She misses you. She often asks after you. Will you not return to her?" The hot fury that he gripped Jaime eased. Jaime had no doubt that Cersei missed him. She missed his cock, she missed having someone she could manipulate, she might even miss their late-night conversations as they lay in bed after pleasuring one another. But if Tywin knew any of that, he would not be waving Cersei in front of Jaime to try to lure him back to the family. Cersei was Jaime's greatest shame. He had considered confessing to Lord Stark when he had spoken to him on the road, but the great and honorable Ned Stark would never suffer a sister fucker in his lands. If he had any clue what Jaime and Cersei had been up to when they had been no more than 4 and 10 and first exploring bodies that had changed, he would either arrest Jaime or challenge him. While Jaime would win any challenge Ned Stark issued, he did not want to kill the man. But he was also too afraid of death to allow the better man to win by laying down his life. And if Stark arrested him, the choices for his crime would be death or the black. When Jaime had lived with the Dustins, the cold had been enough to cut through every layer of clothing and make him feel as though he were being stabbed by tiny daggers. And yet, the Dustins often spoke of how the cold at the wall was far more intense. As much as Jaime feared death, he might choose it over taking the black. No, his shame with Cersei was his and his alone. Cersei has what she wants. She is a queen. She rules the courts at King's Landing. There is no place for me there, just as there is no place for me in Casterly Rock. But I have found my place in Castle Lyanna. I will continue to work there. And if you would like to avoid war with the North, I suggest that you not offer Ned Stark a betrothal between his daughter and me. In the South, marrying a girl to a man 20 years her senior might be perfectly acceptable. In the North, they frown on such things, or at least Lord Stark does. Jaime stood. As of right now, he felt like he had won this encounter, and any wise tactician knows that once victory has been assured, one needs only to avoid making a mistake severe enough to undermine it. So it was time for Jaime to leave before he said something he regretted, something that Lord Tywin could take advantage of. He stood, bowed mockingly to his father, and strode out of the tent. Chapter 13, in Essos. Chapter text. Gerald was talking to William Dare about their household budget when Viserys slammed the door open and charged into the room. Gerald. Gerald, I have a wonderful idea. A sharp crack filled the air as the door impacted the wall. Gerald had his hand on his sword before he realized that it was only Viserys. Dare half stumbled out of his chair. They were both too old for such surprises. My lord? Gerald asked as William sank back down into his chair and collected the scattered notes on their food expenses. I've had the most wonderful idea, Viserys repeated. We want to put me back on the Iron Throne. What if something disastrous were to happen to Robert Baratheon? You know how he loves throwing tournaments. All he seems to do is attend tournaments and drink and whore if the stories we hear are correct, so let's hire someone who can enter in the melee. My lord, Gerald said wearily. He was the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, and he was stuck tending this unschooled boy in a man's body. Dane and Lannister got to train the young king, and he had to deal with Viserys and his madness. If he were not so recognizable, he would demand that one of those two change places with him, not that Lannister knew what plot he had landed in the middle of. It annoyed him that Jaime Lannister got a better assignment because of his ignorance. However, serving in the Kingsguard required him to put aside his personal preference. Viserys ignored Gerald's interruption and kept explaining with an excess of enthusiasm. Whoever we hire can take a spear or javelin as their weapon, and when the melee starts and the king is watching, our man can throw the weapon straight at the usurper and kill him. Then all of Westeros would beg me to come back and lead them, and I wouldn't be spending all the kingdom's coin on whores. And I could marry Dany just like my parents married, and we would have children, and we would be the king and the queen, and all of our children would be princes and princesses. Viserys blurted the words while darting about the room like a man who had drunk far too much herb ale. Dare spoke. My lord, forgive me, but that plan seems dangerous. Dare had been the one to remove the children from Dragonstone before Gerald and the others had found them in Essos, so Viserys would listen to him more than the rest of the Kingsguard, but the madness held him in too tight a grip today. No. We wouldn't even have to go to Westeros. We would just have to find someone who is willing to die for our cause. Viserys said it as if finding such a man would be the easiest thing in the world. And where would we find such a man? Gerald asked. We have gold. We could hire someone. We might not even have to pay him. If he knows that I am the rightful king of Westeros, he should want to die for me. He spoke as if they did not have to count every coin twice before spending it. Both the North and Dawn sent a small stipend, but Viserys' madness required them to replace far more furnishings than was normal, and they had servants they had removed from Dragonstone when Stark's message had first arrived. They had to pay those salaries because those people could not find other work, not when they were so closely associated with the Targaryens. It meant they had an excess of staff and a lack of coin, even with most of the staff taking a fraction of their pay. When added to the cost of additional security and having to move whenever spies grew too close, their budget had no room for hiring an extra horse, much less an assassin. My lord, Gerald said softly, we have discussed this. The law of conquest supersedes the law of secession. Your father's armies were defeated to a man, that ended any claim you have on the throne. Assassinating the usurper would not change that. Gerard did not tell him that were the nobles of Westeros to see Viserys, they would never accept him in any role, much less king. King Aerys had been the same as a child, vacillating between this strange energy that made him believe that he could accomplish anything and the deep throes of melancholy that made it hard for him to accomplish anything. Gerard suspected that it was his madness that made Aerys believe he could ride into Duskendale and negotiate with rebels without fearing for his life. Before that, the king had simply been like Viserys. Unbalanced. But the cruelty didn't come until he'd been tortured. He suspected that any significant hardship would send Viserys down that same path to cruelty. But if he could conquer my family after we had ruled for so long, we should be able to conquer him. Viserys' voice had a childlike petulance. We have no armies for such a feat, Gerald said. And even if we did have an army, it is sure that every kingdom save, perhaps, Dawn would rise for King Robert. Lord Stark had sent word to Dragonstone the moment Prince Rhaegar fell in order to save the Queen and her children. He sent coin to support their household. He protected the true king, hiding him as Benjen Stark's bastard. However, he had been clear that he would never rise against the usurper. While Drold would find a pathway to putting Daemon on the throne eventually, he would have to work around the king's idiot uncle and Stark's devotion to his even more idiotic Baratheon friend. The Reach was loyal to my father, and parts of the Stormlands were, and parts of the Vale and parts of the Riverlands. And the only reason why the North rose against my father was because my father made a terrible mistake by killing the Warden of the North. He ought not have done that. If he had just sent Brandon Stark home with his father, the North never would have risen, and then King Robert would never would have been King Robert, and my brother Rhaegar would have been the king now, and I would be a prince. There has to be a way to make it go back like that. I want to be a prince again. If we kill the usurper, then I can be the prince. Drold and Daenerys exchanged weary looks. Neither of them knew what words to say to pierce the delusions and unrealistic hopes that haunted Viserys' mind. Drold crossed the room and sat on a couch, patting the cushion to invite Viserys to sit next to him. He did so, although he sat like a cat on a bed of thorns. You are right that your father should not have killed Brandon Stark or his father. But your father forgot that the king is less free than any other man. He has to meet his obligations or his kingdom will lose faith in him. Even before Robert Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne, your father had already lost his kingdom because he lost himself. What do you mean a king isn't free? The king is the freest person in the whole kingdom. He gets to decide what he wants to do. Confusion drained away his excess energy. Drold had explained this before, but he struggled to find the right words to make a lasting impression on Viserys' damaged mind. If the lord of a minor house is overly fond of whores or dice or drink, I doubt anyone would care. I doubt they would bother to speak of it. If the lord paramount of one of the kingdoms indulges in the same sins, people will whisper behind his back and perhaps begin to distrust his judgment. The Stormlands did not all rise for Baratheon because, even as a young man, he was known to be overly fond of whores and wine. The Riverlands were equally split because Holster Tully was known to be an angry and controlling man who was far too quick to punish his vassals for minor offenses. Because they had power, their faults were displayed for others to judge. But there is no man in the kingdom that is as visible as the king. From the westernmost part of Westeros to the eastern shore of Essos, most people of status know that Baratheon is a drunkard and a lecher. He does not have the privacy afforded another man. And that makes him less free. Viserys tilted his head to the side like a puppy confronted with a new sound. But you said that my father lost his kingdom before the usurper took the throne because he didn't control himself. He shouldn't have burned people alive. That was wrong. But the usurper is also wrong. He shouldn't sleep with whores or use the coin of the realm to pay for things he can afford. Does that mean he's already lost the throne even if he's sitting on it? Drold hoped so. Daenerys shot him an amused look, but Drold kept his gaze focused on Viserys. Possibly, my lord. Then when he loses the throne, I can take it. I'm 10 and 7 now. I'm a man. I should be taking up the mantle of a man. You are, my lord. You are quite advanced in languages and I understand that your work on the practice field has improved significantly. Viserys wrinkled his nose. I'm not training to be a sellsword. I should be a king. I should be prince, at the very least. And then I can marry Daenerys and we can have children. You will never marry your sister, Drold said firmly. If something were to happen to Daemon, Daenerys would be the last chance to return a Targaryen to the throne. Drold's family had a difficult relationship with power, and he believed some of the Hightower's actions had been foolish or malicious. However, he believed that without a steady ruling family, Westeros would fall into endless wars, returning to the madness that had ruled the continent before Targaryens appeared. Robert did nothing to consolidate power or improve the kingdom, and after he died, other kingdoms would start to question what benefit they gained from the tax they paid. Once that happened, the kingdom would be in a constant state of rebellion and civil war. So he would not allow Daenerys to be trapped in a marriage with someone so unsuited to rule, someone so poisonous to their dream to see a Targaryen on the throne again. My parents married each other, Viserys said stubbornly. Daenerys spoke. Drold might have known Rhaegar and even Aerys better, but Daenerys had known the queen. Your parents were forced to marry, and it was never a happy marriage. Your mother would not want that for you. Daenerys and appeals to the queen could usually get Viserys to alter his course, but this time he was too lost in his own fantasies for the spectre of his mother to prove effective. I'm going to go make a list of all the houses that would rise for me if I could get an assassin to kill the usurper. He ran from the room. Gerard sighed. Viserys was not a bad child. He had an unhealthy interest in his sister, but given that his parents were both husband and wife and brother and sister, Gerald could understand the confusion. The boy did best with simple rules that had no exceptions, but the Game of Thrones was played in nuance. Should we tell him the truth, that he will never sit on the throne? Daery asked. Would he believe us? Gerald countered as he returned to his desk. Daery winced and rubbed the center of his chest. He did that more and more. He insisted that Esso's food disagreed with his stomach, but Gerald had seen men with that habit in the past. It was often associated with a creeping weakness that would make them fall into death without warning. He suspected Daery knew the truth, but neither of them spoke of it. They had all grown used to avoiding certain topics and existing in a state of perpetual waiting. Daery's death was just one more inevitability they were all waiting for. I should speak to Went, Gerald said. Daery nodded, his attention on the accounts in front of him. Not bothering to ask Daery to leave his solar or secure any of the books, Gerald headed into the manse and up to the second floor where Went had his office. He needed to know that the boy's melancholy had tipped once more into madness. Went's solar door was closed, and Gerald knocked. The doors in Essos used a species of wood that felt as insubstantial as parchment. It was strange how something as simple as knocking on a door could make Gerald miss Westeros, miss the Red Keep where he had served most of his life, miss Old Town where he had grown up. No matter how many years he lived here, it was not home. Come in, Went called. Gerald slipped inside the solar and closed the door behind him, providing an illusion of privacy. Luckily everyone in their household knew how important it was to avoid allowing any rumors to leave the walls of their compound. The gods knew this fragile Essos would keep no secrets. Viserys is plotting to retake the throne again. This time he wants to hire an assassin to remove the usurper during a tourney. Gerald sank into one of the chairs across from Went. He was an unattractive man with heavy brows and a long face which was now made longer by shock. Where are we to get the coin for this assassin, and how does killing Robert end with Viserys on the throne? Gerald grimaced. By the 7, if he knew Dawn had offered Princess Arianne, he would rush into marriage and try to carry out one of his plots. And get himself killed, assuming Doran didn't lock him in a very well-appointed set of rooms and use Viserys' name to advance his own plots. True, Went agreed. He scrubbed a hand over his face. But if Prince Doran saw how the madness had taken root in Viserys, he would never allow his daughter to carry a Targaryen child. No, but he could find some sane Dragoseed with white hair and violet eyes and pass the resulting bastards off as belonging to Viserys. It is not as though dragons exist and their deception would be revealed by a dragon's rejection. If Gerald were not loyal to the Targaryen family and if he did not have a better contender for the throne in Daemon whose Stark blood appeared to have blocked the Targaryen madness, he would be tempted to do exactly that. When Rhaegar lacked the madness that haunted Aerys, I thought the blood had stabilized. I knew Rhaegar better than anyone, save Dane, and the madness did not skip him. He obsessed over his prophecies and lacked the good judgment to predict how others would see his actions. His behavior at Harrenhal is proof of that. His madness was only a softer and more palatable version than that of his father or brother. Then again, Gerald suspected that if Rhaegar had walked away from the Trident triumphant and then discovered that his wife and children had been slaughtered like pigs, he would have been as insane and violent as his father. Blood might determine the madness, but it seemed as if grief and hardship dictated the form it took. Have you heard from our friend with the hidden dragon? Went asked, avoiding speaking Daemon's true name or his northern one. Jon. What a horrifically pedestrian name for a king. He is remarkable. He is the best of both his mother and his father, but the lord of his mother's household continues to insist that he is not one for the game. Gerald disliked playing word games, but even if he trusted the members of the household, all of whom had come with the children from Dragonstone, he would not say the name Stark. He also found he did not want to use Lord Stark's name because the sound of it inspired fury. Gerald had given up everything and walked away from his homeland all to honor his prince and his vision of a child who fulfilled the contract of ice and fire made by his family. Daemon should be preparing to take the throne, and he knew Dane would be working to ensure that goal. However, Stark, with ice in his veins and dishonor staining his soul, hoped to block them. If Stark was as honorable as the kingdoms claimed, he would not have turned on Prince Rhaegar because of the sins of King Aerys. But Stark, like every human born, served himself and his ends. And like every human born, he was destined to suffer setbacks. Baratheon was squandering the goodwill of his people and driving his kingdom into debt. His oldest child was, from every report he had read, a well-mannered girl. But their people in the Red Keep suggested that the Crown Prince at 5 years old was already showing more madness than the late king had at the same age. At 5 years old, Aerys would hide in his room, sitting in the dark, or he would tell people he was going to fly from the parapets because he was a dragon. These were excesses, but at 5, Aerys was not killing cats or cutting them open to pull the unborn kittens out to look on them. He was not delighting in the suffering of servants. Whatever madness Prince Joffrey suffered, it was not the same as what haunted the Targaryen line. Cersei was known to be violent. Rhaegar had refused to marry her, telling his father that rumors claimed she had killed a childhood friend. Perhaps Cersei carried her own madness. That might explain why her twin brother had stabbed the king in the back when he should have guarded him. Gods above, they did not need another royal family plagued by such illnesses of the mind. Went sucked air through his teeth. The hidden dragon has a problem of legitimacy. I do not think our original plan will work. We cannot put Viserys on the throne even long enough to legitimize our dragon. I am aware, but not all kings need be legitimate. We cannot have a Blackfyr on the throne. The Seven Kingdoms will not have it. Went was adamant, and Drold understood that their position was significantly weakened if they couldn't have Viserys take the throne for even a short period of time. Our only other option would be to have the Baratheon king legitimize him. Went laughed a rough and raucous sound. He is more likely to take his warhammer and go north to smash in the head of a 9-year-old boy than he is to legitimize him. Then we get creative. As Lord Commander, Drold had often been forced to find creative solutions in order to keep business away from Aerys, who solved every conflict with fire. Burning people alive rarely settled land disputes or feuds, so he had grown skilled at working with the Queen to navigate around King Aerys. The legitimizing paperwork should list the bastard's new name, but perhaps we can write paperwork that only grants him his natural father's rightful name, without listing his rightful father or that the name is Targaryen. If well worded, it could work. And Varys knew how to wield words like daggers into his enemies' hearts. Right now, he did not know about the hidden dragon, but he had so far held their secrets and passed on information to keep the children safe. Perhaps it was time to trust him. Baratheon would never sign it. He loves the idiot of the north, and the idiot loves our boy. Dane plans to make him a hero of the tourney, and legitimizing a bastard who competes well is a long-standing tradition. We need only phrase the paperwork carefully. A legitimization that did not give the father's name to be used or establish a new family name would not be legal in the eyes of many. Drold pursed his lips as he considered all the possibilities. There would always be some who rejected their claim because they had aspirations of their own, such as the Lannisters. Unless Tywin had a daughter of an age to marry their dragon, he would never support their claim. And even if they could arrange a marriage to Myrcella, something that would never happen unless Gaemon took his rightful place on the throne, Tywin would still prefer to have his blonde, Lannister-favoring grandsons on that throne. However, many would support any king who could stop the crown from bleeding away their taxes. Perhaps they would see the paperwork as a mummery, but they may prefer that over chaos, he said. Chaos? What do you know that I don't? Went leaned forward with a look of unholy glee. He did appreciate a bit of chaos. He always had. Tywin Lannister has called in the crown's debts. Went whistled. Why would he do that? I suspect it has to do with the fact that both his heir and his spare are currently hiding in the north. So he puts pressure on the king, who puts pressure on his friend Ned Stark to send them home. Went's grin was full of malice. There were more important games afoot than Tywin Lannister's obsession with getting Jaime to take his place at his father's side, but Gerald still enjoyed the news that came from the Westerlands. Jaime had been a naive and silly bit of fluff when he'd first worn a white cape, but he'd always been damn good with a sword. If his father continued to pressure his heir to return home, the younger Lannister might turn to kinslaying to match his sins as a kingslayer. All of them carried wounds from that war, but he could not imagine what that idealistic teenager had become after failing to protect the princess he'd near worshipped. Even in Dawn they spoke of how wild he had gone, how he had tried to choke his father with his bare hands after learning what happened to the children and Princess Elia. Prince Doran spoke fondly of Jaime Lannister, but that sort of failure had a way of carving on a man's soul. "What do we do?" Went asked. "The same as we always have. We try to make sure that Viserys and Daenerys are raised well. We know the obstacles they will have to overcome if they hope to impress the noble families and convince them that not all Targaryens are mad, a task made substantially more difficult by the fact that one of our charges is." Went grimaced. Gerald continued. "Until the hidden dragon knows himself, there is little we can do but what we already are. We prepare. We protect the children. And we ensure that Viserys' madness is managed." Went sucked his teeth again, an annoying habit that Gerald had grown to hate. "Marrying outside the blood seems to have cured our hidden dragon. Mayhaps we should find someone without Targaryen blood for Viserys." Gerald had considered that. Rhaegar believed that keeping the magic in the Targaryen line required marrying someone with magic. His family married Dornish because they had water magic, and the Starks have winter magic. But Dorne has too much Targaryen blood and we could not get a Stark bride. If we marry him to someone without any magic at all, the line may fail. There would be no more dreams, no more magic, no inherent strength or grace. No more babes born with scales or deformations, no more madness when countered. We have 2 children to carry the line. We must trust that. We could get a girl from Ass High. With what coin? Gerald asked. A free girl would have a family that demanded a price, and a slave girl with confirmed magic would cost more than we could pay, and after we freed her and she spent time with Viserys, she would run away. Probably Went said with a sigh. So we must trust the 2 we have and find the best match to get our hidden dragon on the throne. Daenerys is an obvious choice, but if we can get him on the throne without making any matches, all the houses will vie to get their daughters in his bed. It will give us an edge. But getting him to the throne without a suitable wife will be difficult. Gerald wondered what young Daemon would say if he knew that men on 2 different continents were planning his life. That was the curse of being born royalty, and while Daemon did not yet know of his birth, his ignorance did not change the reality. Perhaps Ned Stark wished to keep his nephew out of the Game of Thrones, but unless Robert Baratheon secured the throne for his sons, war was coming. No king could survive being a wastrel and raising taxes. The people would forgive one or the other, but never both. But that served Gerald's purpose, the one he shared with Arthur and Went and Daenerys. The Targaryens finally had a proper prince, raised to rule fairly and justly, and Baratheon was only making Daemon's rise to power more inevitable with his inability to rule well. They may have lost significant battles in this War of Thrones. They lost a good queen Gerald admired. They lost a Dornish princess and her 2 beautiful Targaryen children. They lost a good prince who battled with his obsessions but who always cared about the people. They had lost much. But they had not yet lost the war. And the longer the usurper sat on the throne, the more Gerald saw a pathway to victory. Chapter 14. Chapter text. We received another scroll from Westeros, Oswell said, handing it over to Hightower. He kept their codebooks someplace that even Oswell didn't know. Even in the Red Keep they hadn't had such tight security, but Oswell understood. He had sent his sister-in-law Shella a quick scroll at Harrenhal once, just to let her know that he lived still and would not return to Westeros, and he had never again contacted his family. Protecting the Targaryen children, including their hidden dragon, was too important to risk having messages intercepted. Oswell retreated to the corridor while Hightower translated the code. Oswell waited until Hightower called before he let himself back into the man's solar and settled into one of the guest chairs. "Stark?" Oswell asked. As the hidden dragon grew older, Stark did spend more time querying after the health of Gaejon's aunt and uncle. Oswell respected Lord Stark. The quiet wolf of the north was slowly turning his kingdom into a powerhouse, economically and militarily. Oswell had always liked little Jaime Lannister, even if he had been an arrogant little shit, and having him train the Northmen was a brilliant stroke. Hightower believed Stark when he said he planned to keep his family away from the throne, but Oswell wasn't as sure. "No. It's Arthur," Hightower said. How is the prince? Oswell tried to avoid calling him Gajan or John around the others. They rarely called him anything except the Hidden Dragon, but when they did, it was always Gaemon, as if Lady Lyanna had survived to name the boy properly. Benjen Stark named him Gajan and called him John, but both names infuriated the others. Hightower focused on the text. Our little white lion cub continues to excel with the sword, and the hidden dragon follows in his footsteps, exceeding even our cub's talent at the same age. Oswell sucked on his teeth as he considered what it would mean to have a king who exceeded Jaime's talent with the sword. Of course, success at the tourney was only one part of their scheme, but with each passing year, Oswell felt more confident that their plans were progressing. Has our cub reconciled with his father? It says nothing on the subject, so likely not. Considering he is not a Targaryen, he has the obsessive tendencies of one. Oswell laughed. Jaime had been 5 and 10 when he'd first appeared in the capital in his white cloak, so proud of himself. The politics and plotting and depravity at the capital had chewed that boy to pieces and spat him out in the dirt, probably because he had been so certain that men were good and the knights were valiant. No half-grown child should have been appointed to the White Cloaks to see what the Mad King did and what the King's Guard was forced to witness, but Aerys could not be moved from his scheme, not even by the Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, and Hightower had tried. In truth, Jaime had been little more than a boy, a hostage against his father's goodwill and support for the crown. Oswell hoped he was happier in the north. Benjen had a good reputation, and from what Arthur had written, it seemed he was a good lord. Hightower studied the scroll. I'm still surprised that Arthur has taken the cub in since he didn't protect the children. You have heard the story as well as I, Oswell said sharply. He was protecting the city from the madman. You remember the boy, how he was all bright eyes and idealism. He would have the lives of innocents first in his mind, so his choice to put a sword in the back of a man who would have ordered their deaths is easily forgiven. I'm sure Arthur feels the same. Despite that, the children died. He did not serve them, even if he felt he could no longer serve the king. Hightower had an inhuman ability to never compromise. Before the war, Oswell had talked to the other White Cloaks. He'd mourned with them that they were trapped serving a mad king who would have best benefited the realm by dying. While none of them would have killed Aerys, they all struggled to serve him. Only Commander Hightower stood on his oaths, insisting on giving King Aerys his complete loyalty until the king's last breath. You and I both remember that silly little cub. Are you surprised that he misjudged his father's intent in sending soldiers? Do you really think he is the sort of boy who would have expected his own father to murder babes in the cradle? Hightower grimaced. They both knew Jaime had carried a strain of idealism that went far too deep to survive the capital, and when it shattered as he stood outside the Queen's chambers and listened to the king rape his own wife, Jaime had broken. Is all well with our little cub? Oswell asked. Arthur writes mostly of our hidden dragon. What of him? Arthur hopes to enter him in Squires Melee next year when he reaches his 10th name day. Our lion cub will sponsor him, and the dragon's supposed father supports us. He has convinced his idiot brother not to interfere. Oswell barely avoided a snort of laughter. Hightower and his inflexible beliefs. The rest of the 7 kingdoms might see Lord Stark as the most honorable of men, the quiet wolf whose rare words were listened to by everyone, the Stark who was rebuilding the north. But to Hightower, he would always be the idiot. They had tried to get the commander to use any number of other coded names for Lord Stark, but that was the only one he would use. Oswell and William were both amused by Hightower's intransigence. Why would Arthur risk the dragon's life? Squires are not as well trained, accidents are more likely to happen when half-grown boys swing blunted swords about. Arthur wants the South to see his skills. He writes that the idiot's brother told the idiot that it was important for the dragon to be seen as a leader if he was going to finish the Song of Ice and Fire. The idiot was convinced to allow it because it would serve the prophecy to have the hidden dragon respected throughout the realm. No one has told the idiot that we plan to have him legitimized. Otherwise, he would likely object more. Oswell picked at the side of his nose where a bug had bitten him. I understood Rhaegar's obsession, it was the most benign form of Targaryen madness. But I am still shocked that a practical man like your idiot should hold to the same insanity. That had never made sense to Went. Then again, his was a younger house, not one of these ancient noble houses with dusty old tales and delusions that their blood was destined to save the world. He's an idiot, Hightower said. He builds a castle where one is not needed, and now he builds western towns and hires Ibinese sailors who can hunt whales as if those monsters cannot destroy ships. I fear he may even infect our hidden dragon with the idea that he should not sit on the throne. A boy admires his elders, but eventually he grows into a man who makes his own choices. The true impediment is the illegitimate nature of his birth. Is Arthur sure he can earn fame at the tourneys? Is it time to speak to the tree? Oswell thought calling Varys a tree ridiculous, but it was true that he had his little birds, and birds did roost in trees. We have time before watering any trees. Once the secret is known by anyone in the Red Keep, we must be ready to move at an instant. We cannot have him be legitimized without speaking to the tree, or the name on the paper will undermine our hope to return a Targaryen to the throne. Hightower glared at him. I know. Oswell fell silent. They could all see war on the horizon. Baratheon was weak and rarely even attended court. He drank and hoard and mismanaged the taxes to the point that the Reach was suffering under such a burden that others' houses had started to feel pity for them. If it were not for the Northmen who had taken up the position of Master of Coin, the Baratheon reign may have already ended. After all, the other kingdoms needed the food out of the Reach as much as they needed the iron and gold from the Westerlands. If the Reach rose against the usurper, the other kingdoms might not fall into line behind Robert. But Mandaeali could only delay the inevitable. Robert's son was as unbalanced as the worst Targaryen, and the realm had enough of mad kings. Stannis was so hidebound and unpopular that only those who cared about the formalities of inheritance would move to his side. And then there were the kingdoms who would fight for independence. The Ironborn certainly would try to break away. So sailors spoke of more pirates when they sailed west, and that generally meant the Ironborn were building more ships. Dorne would break away, counting on their deserts and a fractured Westeros to protect them. Oswell hoped the kingdom could wait until the rightful king was old enough to get legitimized and impress the lords and ladies of the realm. Otherwise, the war would decimate the kingdom, and since Oswell's nephews and niece were at Harrenhal in the path of any armies, he hoped to avoid that. We may have to reveal the truth to force your idiot into backing the true king. If we have to, we will. But the usurper needs to be gone first. The idiot clings to his honor and friendships with more tenacity than he clings to any common sense. Someone knocked on the door. Come, Hightower called. The door opened and Laena came in, one hand on her cane, and the other on Daenerys' shoulder. Hightower stood a half-second after Oswell. My Lady Hightower offered with a smile for Daenerys. She curtsied. The young lady has a confession to make, Laena said. Her voice was unsteady with age, but her eyes were as clear as when she had been Rhaegar's nursemaid. For 50 years she had tended Targaryen children and befriended Targaryen queens, and she had been at Queen Rhaella's side when she had passed. Oh? Oswell asked. Daenerys would not meet his eyes. She wouldn't look at any of them. Speak, child. A lady does not hide from the consequences of her actions. She admits her faults and finds a way to atone for her mistakes. Daenerys' shoulders came up, and her head dropped. And she has posture. Laena thumped her cane against the ground, and Daenerys straightened up and looked as dignified as a 9-year-old with tear marks on her face could. Lady Daenerys Hightower said in a kind voice, you are our lady. We will help you with whatever problem you have found yourself in. I just wanted to play, she said softly. Hightower frowned. Play? Oswell's stomach soured. She was the only child in the house. Viserys acted young for his age and he would often indulge his sister in her games, but she would not feel guilt for playing with her brother. Speak or I shall tell them and choose the discipline. If Oswell had a choice of a punishment doled out by Hightower or one by Laena, he would not choose the justice of that old woman. Daenerys must have thought the same because she finally spoke. She is the Warrener's daughter. She has the softest furs and we played at quoits. I know I ought not to have sneaked out. Laena's mouth was set in a hard line. And what was the girl calling you? Daenerys whispered. My name. Oswell sucked in a fast breath. They would need to move. Daenerys was too young and Viserys too unpredictable. If Robert's spies found them, the children would be vulnerable. Hightower stared at the girl, all his emotions tucked away. No doubt he was saying many inappropriate things in his own head, but his control never failed. After a time, he drew a long breath. Oswell, tell Dare we move. Lena, get the household staff to begin packing. I will walk the perimeter and check with our guards. Oswell suspected he would also be questioning the guards as to why they had not seen a little girl sneaking away from the manse. Someone would be horseo-hipped by the morrow. I will write to Prince Doran to see what contingencies he has prepared for us. Lady Daenerys, I wish you had spoken to us, but as you did not and as we cannot know how many people this Warrener's daughter may have spoken to, I will have to ask you to remain in your room as the staff packs the house and prepares for our move. Daenerys sniffed, her head congested and tears already gathering at the corners of her eyes. Oswell wanted to scoop her up and reassure her that all was well, and Dare likely would do exactly that as soon as he had the story, but Oswell was a Kingsguard. He could not be as free with her as the other man. So he silently mourned that a little girl could not have friends. The life of a royal was always difficult, but sometimes it felt like these children carried too many burdens. Even Jon in his distant castle, living with a man he believed to be his father, would have his life dictated by his birth sooner or later. Adults should carry the burdens, not children. When Oswell caught Lena's eyes, he could see his regret reflected in them. Fate and the gods were unkind, and all they could do was provide as best as they could. They did not have the power to do more. Chapter 15, Roose Bolton. Chapter text. Do you truly believe this will work? Jon Umber asked the moment he drew his horse up beside Roose. Behind them stretched out a long train of guards and servants. Roose was prepared to kill in order to get the wildlings to listen, but he also understood the value of bribery, so he had brought wagons of food and ale and warm clothing. Roose considered his words. Jon Umber was a loyal Stark man, so Roose dare not suggest that he served himself more than his liege lord. Most of these northerners were not born from the blood of kings as Boltons were, even if the Red Kings had been conquered long before the Targaryens arrived. No, these men were from houses that were bred to serve, and that required certain handling. Do you doubt Lord Stark's plan? To bring wildlings south of the wall? I do doubt it, but if it allows me to reclaim my family's lands, I will do what I must. If there are more conditions you wish to place on the wildlings, now is the time to discuss them. It is our lands they will settle in until it is time to move west, so demand of them whatever concessions you will. Umber grunted. I dislike demanding concessions of any man who does not owe them to me by birth. The man was a great fool, but then most northerners were. Even most Southrons were, although at least they were more willing to fight for a crown. Granted that fight was rarely won on the battlefield. No, they fought through their daughters the great game of marriage that Roose himself had entered just to be able to get his family south when the great night came. It remained to be seen whether Stark's scheme would offer more benefits. He did like the idea of retaining the Dread Fort. It was his family's legacy. Perhaps Roose ought not to have trimmed the family tree as much as he did, leaving only Dominic to carry forth the Bolton name in the south and Snow to hold their territory for as long as possible in the north. If Stark's plan bore fruit, he was still young enough to father more children. True, most would hesitate to marry a daughter into his house due to his reputation. Roose openly shared his scorn for those who disdained the violence and torture on which most own family wealth rested. There was not a noble family in all of Westeros that had earned their position through kindness or generosity, although there were a few that seemed to stumble into it through sheer incompetence. The Tyrells were evidence of that. The Freys had many girls of marriageable age, and they had no doubt been brought up to understand the true nature of power and the danger of trying to exert influence where they had none. Truly, a Free could make an excellent wife, although the men were worthless cunts. I believe this plan could reap great benefits, Roose said. You and I both know how important it is to have whaling ships and warships on the west coast, but do you have men to spare for such settlements? After a few centuries of Targaryen's wars and then Robert's rebellion, we have only half the men we once had on Umberland. If this works, I hope to keep many wildlings to work on my holdfasts. And I hope for the same, Roose admitted. Others would sometimes get immigrants from further south, but he didn't. Soft Southerns refused to live under his rule, but the wildlings would understand him, perhaps even respect him. We are both likely to be disappointed, Umber added after a moment of silence where only the thumping of horses' hooves filled the air. Do you believe we will be unable to defeat their leaders in battle and claim the right to lead them according to their own traditions? Roose asked. Umber was so predictable. He drew himself up in righteous anger and glared at Roose, all his emotions on display without understanding how much power he gave away through that action. I can beat any man alive in a fair fight. I doubt the wildlings fight fair. Umber's smile turned more devious. And I can beat most men in an unfair fight, he added. However, the wildlings have vowed to not kneel for any man. Do you plan to ask them to kneel to you, John Umber? Roose asked with some amusement. So many of the lesser houses only understood power when it was presented in such obvious ways. We all have to kneel before Robert Baratheon. If King Robert were here, that would be a dilemma. However, I myself remember the impetuous, whoring young man who defeated the prince at the Trident, and I never planned to kneel for him. Of course, that means I will avoid him if he should happen to wander north. Umber laughed. Fair enough. You may avoid literal kneeling, but you still have to live under the laws he sets. No, I live under the laws Ned Stark sets, and if he were to start whoring and raising my taxes so that he could pay for those whores, I would not feel obligated to follow his laws either. Umber looked shocked. You should not speak such of your liege lord. His voice had an edge of growl to it. Apparently Roose had offended Stark's pet. Ned is well aware of how I speak of him, Roose said. He was actually rather surprised at how flexible Ned Stark's moral code was. He had anticipated more Southron concepts of honor and nobility, especially after Ned had argued so loudly that they should show mercy to the Targaryen children if they took King's Landing. Instead, Ned was far more the northern pragmatist. His father had been as well. Rickard had cheated the crown out of tax monies by building an unsanctioned port on his shore. Roose had no doubt that had the crown learned of it, Rickard would have blamed him. But that was fine because Roose assigned a minor lord of little import to command of the dock. Had Aerys learned of their duplicity, that man would have burned in the place of either Roose or Rickard. Such was the truth of the world. Lesser men always burned for greater ones. But during the war, Ned had carried himself like a newly sworn knight seeking virtuous maidens to save. He'd threatened to remove the balls of any man he found raping a woman. He was a contradiction, which had led Roose to doing some investigation of his own. Ned Stark was not as honest as others claimed. If we can find enough wildlings with families willing to settle south, we can not only open to coastal settlement, but we can get the north back up to fighting numbers far more quickly, Roose said. The wildlings are known for being ferocious in battle, and with a little training, they will be unstoppable. I did not realize you were so concerned with the number of men under your banners. Are you not? Umber rode for a time, their horses plodding through the wisps of summer snows that never melted this far north. Perhaps I have some concerns. The rebellion did strip us of many of our most daring and bold fighters. War always does, Roose agreed. But I do not trust wildlings to ride with my men. Again, Umber's tone had that growl that others likely found intimidating. Roose thought it showed a lack of self-control indicative of House Umber's status as a vassal house. Nor would I, which is why I hope to integrate them into my own holdfasts. They may claim that they will not kneel, but the man who has a wife and children waiting at home will choose to serve his liege lord if that serves his family. Then it makes sense that we are allowing only those with wives and at least one child to move south with us, Umber said as if Roose needed his approval for their plan. And I will divide them up and send them south to Benjen's trainer with my men. They will learn to fight together, and I can promise them that if they obey me as their lord, I will let them fight anyone who would issue an insult or challenge. We are not soft Southrons who solve disagreements with words, you and I. True, and you'll kill any of them that refuse your orders. I will. And I will do the same, Umber said loudly. The Marndaelis and Starks might be of the north, but not like we are. We are harder men. Ned was right that we can settle the wildlings where other families could not, he knows his bannermen well. Umber laughed wildly. Yes, Ned might believe in swinging the sword when he makes the judgment, but he is not one to kill a man in challenge. He's a good man, but not the hard man Rickard was. Mind you, I prefer Ned's leadership. Rickard never did listen much, and now Ned is offering us land in return for a task that will only benefit us. He's a good leader, Roose said. Under Ricard, Roose had been prepared to abandon the north because the man didn't share information or compromise with his lords. Roose had suspected that he saw the signs of the coming darkness, but he spoke nothing and seemed to do even less. Boltons, Reeds, and Starks all had the gift of green sight, but he had remained silent, even when Roose tried to initiate conversations. And Roose refused to wait until the situation was so dire that he couldn't escape. He suspected Ricard kept silent to avoid an exodus that would have left him fewer bannermen to fight for him. Ricard with his high-handed tactics had not been the right tool to unite the houses, which is why Roose had been seeking ways to move his true family south. I recognize that expression, Umber said. What expression is that? Roose was quite certain that his father had schooled him out of having any expression at all. We've ridden to war together, Roose. I know you better than most, and you are scheming. You must know that Ned would not give you access to a resource such as the wildlings unless he had plans to handle it if you choose to betray him. Of that, I have no doubt, Roose said. But it is not Ned who I am considering. Good, because the days of the Red Kings are gone, and for one, I would rather not see them return. You might find flaying a fine tradition, but the rest of us find it distasteful. Roose understood that full well. In general, the North did not approve of his family's history or his own more brutal tactics. Roose had ordered the rape of women in order to demoralize the Targaryen loyalists, but Ned had stopped him, and as a whole, the North agreed. No other lord would order rape used, and more than a few had looked at him askance because he had argued for it. Perhaps a few generations of poor leadership from the Starks and Bolton self-restraint could tip the favor toward the ascendancy of House Bolton, but that would not be in Roose's lifetime. So he did not bother thinking on eventualities that were not possible. If not against Ned, then who are you scheming against? I do not know. Umber pulled his horse around to study Roose. What a strange answer. I would suspect you of lying, but you've always been willing to openly speak your disdain for those you considered enemies. Most of my enemies are well worth my disdain, Roose said, but it is not my enemies I look to. Mayhaps it was time for other lords to start preparing their own men for the wars to come. Roose would not speak of the great night that was on the horizon. Other families lacked his own penchant towards prophetic dreams, and Northerners were famous for never believing what they could not see. So Roose would give them another enemy. If it turned out that he spoke truth, that was all the better. Have you sent your men south to train with Benjen and the Oathbreaker? Umber guided his horse back onto the path next to Roose. They may call him the Mad Kingsguard, but he is brilliant with a sword and at training others. My men come back far more battle-ready, and they respect his training so much that they continue to drill and practice when they return. It is a wise investment to send men south for training. Umber spoke as if he had to defend the choice to train his men. Wise indeed. Have you met the one who assists the Oathbreaker? An older man with not a hair on his head and a nasty slice on his cheek. He is not one for engaging in conversation, Umber said. I would not say I have met him, only looked on him. I found him equally reticent, Roose said, but when I met him, there was something so familiar about his demeanor. I could not place it for a long time. He had all of Umber's attention now. And have you placed it now that you have more time to think on it? You know I sent my son south to play squire. Roose noted that Ricard had been pursuing Southron connections himself, trying to marry each of his children to different houses in the south, which would have given him multiple paths of retreat even while he had failed to prepare northern houses. At least Ned was moving to ensure they were all prepared, even if he was not decisive enough. Roose could start to repair that fault here. No decision you could have made would have shocked me more, but I did hear of it, Umber agreed. Even before Robert's rebellion, when Domeric was a babe in the cradle, I thought to send him south and build more connections for House Bolton. Brandon would have been a good warden of the north, but trade would have suffered under him. I wished to arrange for trade on my own merits. Then having a son with a Southron wife makes sense. You know he is likely to return home engaging in all of those pageantries of battle that you complained about so bitterly during the rebellion. Roose grimaced. I am aware. I will ensure that my son breaks whatever southern habits he develops once he returns, but because I planned to send him, I spent a significant amount of time attending tournaments and considering which regions and which knights would best serve my interests. And you chose the Vale. They are close enough to facilitate trade, but far enough south that their winters are milder, and they have an excess of produce. I stand by my choice. I'm still confused. I was always known as the fighter. You were the thinker. If you wish for me to make connections between these statements of yours, you must tell me what connections to make more explicitly. Roose rode in silence for a time, facilitating the impression that he was divided and struggled with whether to share some great knowledge with John Umber. I recognized him, Roose said in a tone even quieter than his usual. He found that if he forced people to strain to hear his words, it gave them a certain importance that he could not replicate by shouting. I assume you plan on telling me where you recognize him from, Umber said. Roose kicked his horse into a canter and increased the distance between them, and the men followed. When Umber followed, Roose slowed his horse to a walk and allowed the two horses to drift closer to one another. The man is Arthur Dayne, Roose revealed. The Sword of Morning, Rhaegar Targaryen's greatest knight, and the brother of the woman that Ned Stark once hoped to marry. For a long time, Umber stared at him with a stupid expression. He truly was more of a fighter than a thinker. Roose controlled an urge to sneer. Why? Umber asked. Why would he be in the north? His eyes searched Roose's face as if an answer could be found there. I am unsure. But I know that Ned has built defensive capabilities south of the Neck. I know that he would build a large fleet in the west, along with the settlements to support it. And while I agree that whaling would be a great boon to our families in winter and an even greater boon to the war, it also occurs to me that the Starks would have a war fleet for the first time in hundreds of years. Umber finally began putting a few of the pieces together on his own. The man had not been blessed with intelligence. And he offers to have 2 former King's Guards train our men at a fraction of the coin we would pay anyone else's service, Roose added. Were it not for Umber's impressive skills on the battlefield, the man would be useless. He still looked confused. Has he been hiding Jaime Lannister and Arthur Dayne all this time? I know not, but I know the Dustin men are far better trained now than they were during the rebellion. It's more likely they had someone training their men. Umber finally made the connection, and watching the enlightenment cross his face would have been amusing, had Roose been amused by stupidity. Umber lowered his voice to a whisper. Does Ned plan on moving for the Iron Throne? The Martells and the Starks are the only remaining descendants of those who were kings when the Targaryens arrived. Baratheon's claim comes from having a Targaryen grandmother. If we have deposed the Targaryens, I don't know why his grandmother's dragon blood made him more suitable as a king than Ned. Ned should have taken that throne. Umber was getting more and more animated. Apparently he liked the idea of a northern man on the throne. However, Ned was the wrong man for that task. I would be inclined to agree, but Ned is not one to survive King's Landing. Umber puffed up in offense. Ned is one of the greatest fighters and war leaders I have ever met. True, but Robert Baratheon was the other great war leader and fighter, and he is a terrible king. I believe Ned simply recognized that in himself earlier than Robert. Confusion swept over Umber. Then why are we building our armies? Because Robert is losing control of the capital. To whom? This was delicate work, and Roose considered his words. Umber's loyalty to Ned made him useful, but his temper made him volatile. It's been 10 years since the war, and only now is a Northman on the small council. By either coincidence or through the manipulation of his poisonous wife, Robert has decided that all the capable folk come from the Westerlands. The Lannisters have everything except the title of king, then when Joffrey takes the throne, the Baratheons might as well disappear into history. The boy will carry on the Baratheon legacy. Will he? Roose asked. He has none of his father's look, none of his temperament, his strength, his prowess. From what I have heard, the boy is the worst of House Lannister and nothing of House Baratheon. You believe the boy a bastard? Shock made Umber's voice louder than was prudent. Roose had not, at least not until Umber asked that exact question. Roose had thought it bad luck that Robert's younger 2 children took after his wife, and many saw them as more Lannister than Baratheon, but now that he thought about it, when Lannisters married outside the family, they often lost the yellow hair in the next generation. Roose knew any number of dark-haired Lannister children because of that quirk, and most Lannisters chose to marry a blonde rather than lose their trademark appearance. The rumor had been that Cersei had been obsessed with marrying Rhaegar not only because she hoped to be queen but also because she was obsessed with having blonde children who she could dote on. Her first child, the girl, had the look of a Baratheon, everyone said as much. But the stories from the capital said that both boys were blonde and green-eyed. Why had Roose not seen that particular possibility? He felt quite the fool having Jon Umber identify this Savas piece. Roose had a son who was learning to excel in southern manners and the king's only heir might turn out to be a girl. He refocused on Umber and their conversation. I know not, but it's possible. Certainly Baratheons are all known for being dark-haired, and Lannisters too easily lose the fairness that marks them when they marry someone of a different coloring. 2 generations back there was a Lannister who married a Tully, and there is not a hint of blonde hair in the Tully line today. Umber leaned closer, the saddle creaking under his weight. The old lion will go to war for that. That's his grandson destined to sit on the throne, even if the boy is not a Baratheon. So we need to prepare for war once Robert dies. Remove the bastard. I know not whether the boy's a bastard, but I do know he is uncommonly cruel. The reports from King's Landing say that he orders servants beaten and has killed small animals for sport. He is too weak to hunt for himself, and he refuses to train with any weapon because he feels that it would be inappropriate for his subjects to see him struggle to develop a skill. Apparently his father has purchased him a large number of weapons, and the boy delights in flaunting them without being able to use any of them. Roose could see that that made an impression. No one in the north would follow a leader who couldn't wield a weapon. It was simply not done. Even most women could handle a bow, and women who were trained in the weapon were often respected to lead men when their husbands were away. But a man who refused to invest the effort to learn any weapon at all would never have an order followed. You think Ned plans? I think Ned would be guilty of treason were he to speak to us of any of this. I think Ned waits to see if Robert can attend to his own house. I do not know what Ned thinks in truth because I will not ask my liege lord to speak against the king when it could cost him his head. Roose stared at Umber. The man started to nod his head. I'll not ask Ned to bend the knee for some sadistic cunt who doesn't know how to lift a sword. I'd rather go to war for him than have the North subject to a king like that. Roose straightened in the saddle, satisfied at how his conversation had gone. The North would be strengthened against the others. Umber would quietly speak to his strongest allies, men and women who would never trust Roose, and if Roose had a chance to put Domeric on that throne, that would be a boon. Unnecessary for his plans, but a boon. You and I agree on that point. We will not bow to a weak king, and if Ned raises banners, I will rejoice in that war, and I plan to have many well-trained men ready to march down the king's road. And if this plan failed, there would still be stronger armies and more prepared lords to hold the line in the name of honor while Roose and his true family fled south. Perhaps Ned saw a path to victory. The Starks, like the Boltons, were known for their prophetic dreams, although history remembered only that Targaryens possessed the skill with their dragon dreams. Roose's dreams confirmed that there was no path forward for him. His line would end in the north if he did not take them south of the neck. He could rely on Domeric to find a path in the south or put faith in Ned and believe that he had seen Lightbringer and knew who was to carry the sword into battle against the Night King. For now, Roose would work to achieve both goals. If the boy is not of Robert's blood, the Lannisters will get rid of Robert the moment he comes of age, Umber warned. I would not expect them to move the moment he turned 6 and 10. The timing of that would be too suspect. But once the boy has a year or two of adulthood, I expect Robert will develop an unexpected illness or suffer a terrible accident. How old is the boy now? Umber asked. 5. The girl is 7, and the younger brother 2. The youngest is also as blonde and green-eyed as any Lannister at Casterly Rock. So the Queen gave him 1 true-born and 2 bastards. That means we have a little more than 10 years to build an army in the north that can challenge the crown. We won't stand alone, Roose said. The Reach is no friend of Robert. Even now, he bans them from court. The Vale is connected to Ned through his good sister, Lysa Arryn. The Riverlands are connected to him through his wife. He has an heir, 2 sons, and 2 daughters that he can marry off, as well as an unmarried brother and his brother's natural-born son. The South functions through marriage alliances. That is the battlefield they prefer to fight on, and Ned might be able to secure that battlefield before Robert realizes there's a war. In truth, Ricard had played the southern game of marriages rather well. Roose continued, if Ned rises against Robert's son, Dawn will remember that it was Ned who gave them justice for Elia Martell. He attempted to protect the family. He may have failed, but Dawn is not unrealistic. They know that a man can fail at a task without losing his honor. The Reach may rise for him for the same reason. The Targaryens were their kings, and Ned tried to offer mercy and did offer justice for the last of them. That's why he needs men and women to march under his banners and populate towns on our western coast. Umber's expression turned fierce. Then we need to convince these wildlings to come south. Umber had just gone from an uneasy and only minimally willing participant to a man fully committed. We aren't going to convince them. If Ned wanted someone to talk to them, he would have sent Mandaeli. These people respect only strength. We're going to demand they send people south and kill anyone who thinks to tell us otherwise. Umber smiled brightly and slapped Roose on the shoulder. We're going to do exactly that. Roose did enjoy how easily manipulated some people were. He allowed himself the briefest smile before turning his attention back toward the north, waiting for his first glimpse of the wall. Chapter 16. Chapter text. Jon slipped to the side and brought his sword around, hitting his cousin in the small of his back before moving behind him. Robb tried to counter by whirling around, but he moved too fast for his footwork, and when Jon thrust with his sword, Robb tripped and hit the ground of Castle Lyona's training grounds. Maybe his home wasn't as grand or old or heated by hot springs, but they had the best training grounds teachers. Every lord of the north sent their people here for that very reason, and Jon trained with all of them. For a brief second, anger clouded Robb's expression, but then he sagged. Yield. You have gotten too good for me. It's practicing for the tourneys that makes him so, Sir Jaime said. Jon grinned at him, but he cleared his expression when he saw his Aunt Cat. She never liked it when Robb lost, and Jon hoped his cousin did not get a tongue lashing. I hope to enter the real melee the year I turn 10 and 6. That means I have only 4 years to be as good as any man who will enter. It's not like the squire's tourneys. His uncle Ned made a face, but he often did when the subject of tourneys came up. He was of the opinion that they were all frippery and southron foolishness, but Jon hoped to perform well enough to get legitimized. He knew his uncle's opinion that natural sons were children of the north and more tied to the land, but he had Stark blood, and if he hoped to hold Castle Lyona after his father passed, being legitimate would only help. Arden agreed that gaining the king's favor would make his future more secure, and Arden never lied, not even when Jon wanted him to. You're going to do great, Minister Tyrion said. Jon was shorter than most boys his age, except for the Crannog men who trained here, but that didn't slow the speed of his footwork or the strength of his swing. Jon grinned at him. Better than you would, Minna Lannister. Tyrion gave him a mock scowl, but he couldn't keep the corners of his mouth from curling in amusement. Jon Snow. Cat said in her most scandalized voice. Do not speak to Tyrion Lannister with such disrespect. Jon hunched his shoulders. He should have remembered his aunt was watching and curbed his tongue. Jaime snorted. If my brother wants respect, he'll speak to others with it. Given how he addresses Jon, I assume he wants to be told the truth. He's short. Ouch, Tyrion said in a mocking voice. Lord Stark, Lady Stark. Good morning. Tyrion, Uncle Ned said. Jon liked that Uncle Ned and Aunt Cat never made a face at Tyrion because he was misformed. He was smart and he would explain things that others would not, so Jon was predisposed to like him. If Jon was the Lord of Castle Lyona, he would pay the maester's fees so Tyrion could study, but father was young and Jon would not have that right for many years. Besides, Jon thought Sir Jaime would be sad if he didn't have his brother. I was just going to break my fast when I heard the sounds of boys showing off for their parents. Tyrion nodded toward Jon's father. I thought I would watch and then let you know that Bran is awake. Both Robb and Jon are developing into fine swordsmen, Uncle Ned said. He put out a hand to help Robb up. But I lost. And you will lose often if you challenge yourself, Uncle Ned told him. Only a weak man chooses to fight those who lack the talent to beat them. A strong man pits himself against those who are strong so he can get better. Robb grinned at Jon. What about a strong woman? Arya asked from the shadows. She practices at the bow and leaves the swords for the men, Aunt Cat said sharply. John felt sorry for Arya. Sansa was good at the womanly arts that Aunt Catelyn preferred, but Arya had none of her mother's talents. She had told John that she actually did train with swords, but everyone at Winterfell chose to not tell Lady Stark. Enough. We should all go inside to break our fast, father said. After John had put his training sword away and returned to father's side, he draped an arm over John's shoulders. I'm proud of you, he said softly as he guided John inside. Castle Lyanna was a fraction of the main keep at Winterfell and lacked most of the older buildings, but John loved the feel of the castle. He loved the small carvings hidden in the stones, the feel of life that settled like a mist when it rained, the hidden passages and secret doors. It was the most wonderful castle in the world, and he was proud as he and father led the family to the main dining hall. Bran was at the table, as were Sansa and her friend Jane. John didn't like her. She called Arya horseface just because she liked girls with round southern faces. But John knew he had to show all their guests courtesy, so he smiled at all of them. Jaime and Tyrion headed for the end of the table where they were separate from family, and Arden hadn't appeared at all. He often had errands of his own and preferred eating alone. He was an odd man, but John liked him. He watched John the way Uncle Ned did. Whenever they visited, Uncle Ned would study him from a balcony or from the shadows of the training yard. John worried that his uncle thought him not capable of handling a holding as important as Castle Lyanna, but Arden always praised John, so he didn't know why they watched him. Why is the king coming here? Father asked once they were all settled. John blinked. He hadn't realized the king was coming. No doubt to ask me to be the hand of the king, Uncle Ned said. Aunt Cat gasped. That's wonderful, she exclaimed, but the look Uncle Ned gave her suggested she did not agree. Starks do not do well in the south, he said. But I have agreed that our families will meet here and we will discuss matters. What happened to Jon Arryn? Father asked as servants came in with bread, cheese, and fish. He has returned to the Vale. The Maesters say that Lysa's inability to have children might be the unhealthy heir in King's Landing. I should write her, Aunt Cat said. Mayhaps I can visit now that she will be at the Vale. She looked at Uncle Ned. We can discuss it, he agreed. John's father had a strange expression. Will you be talked around? You know King Robert will want you to travel south with him. Uncle Ned grinned. I cannot travel from here even if I wanted. I have not packed what I would need to travel longer. I will not be moved from my answer. But Ned Cat said, Hand of the King is a powerful position. You could do a lot of good for the North from that office. I need to be in the North. Umber and Bolton have done well to provide men for the western towns, but I do not trust them to act in the best interest of Starks. As long as Whaley Song and Tail End are on Stark land, it is my job to oversee the building, and it is my job to listen to small folk complaints. I will not leave them without access to their liege lord. Robb could listen to petitions, Aunt Cat argued. John looked up at this and exchanged a glance with his cousin. They'd both grown up on stories of Boltons. That family fondly remembered flaying people alive. Robb looked as horrified as John. Neither of them wanted to be in the same room with Roose Bolton, and John would be terrified for his cousin if Robb had to overrule some decision Bolton had made. No, Uncle Ned said in that tone that meant he was not going to debate the issue further. Father had the same tone, which wasn't surprising since they were brothers. King Robert will be disappointed, Father said. I disappoint him fairly regularly, Uncle Ned answered. I've already told him I will not consider a betrothal for Sansa. What? Aunt Cat's voice rose to a near shriek, and at the end of the table, Sansa put her bread down on her plate. I will not have it, Uncle Ned said. There are rumors that the prince is cruel. We have all seen what happens when a cruel man has the throne. There is no one who can curb his worst nature, so I will not take a chance. Sansa, you are to stay away from the prince. Both the princes. Yes, Father, she said softly, her eyes round, but then she and Jane started whispering. Uncle Ned narrowed his eyes, but he didn't say more. Instead he turned back to Aunt Cat. I have said Myrcella and Robb can meet and we will see if they like one another. Me. Robb yelped the word, and Uncle Ned sighed. I will not agree to a betrothal if she displeases you, but from what I have heard, she is a fair and intelligent young lady. She is said to have the Baratheon temper, but most women of the north are the same. Uncle Ned looked down the table at Arya, who was piling jam on her bread. She didn't notice her father casting aspersions on her temperament. That would be a good match, Aunt Cat said so slowly that it was clear she favored a match for Sansa. Uncle Ned's expression scared Jon. We could foster her in the north so she understood the politics. Uncle Ned slowly nodded. That would be best if the Queen agrees. Jon wondered if he would ever have a wife. He was his father's heir and Castle Lyanna was the source of valuable resources, but he was a bastard. No woman would want a husband with no name to give their children. But if he could get legitimized, he would have a much better chance of finding a good wife. There was little Jon wanted more than a big family. He envied Robb with all his siblings and both parents. Jon would always feel guilty that his father could not marry without endangering Jon's inheritance, and he would always want siblings he would never have. But a legitimized bastard had a name. He would be a real Stark, and with Castle Lyanna as his inheritance, he would find a wife. Arden said there were many talented and kind girls whose families had been loyal to the Targaryens. They would struggle to find husbands, and they would support a match to any Stark. He would be an attractive husband with his castle, more so if he could prove himself noble and kind during the tourneys. Father looked at Jon, his long face etched with concern, so Jon smiled and put all his thoughts away. Sir Jaime spoke from the end of the table. How goes Hwaylee Song, Lord Stark? It goes well, Sir Jaime. How would you like to spend a 12-month training the men to defend the coast? Jaime shivered. If they come down here, I will happily train them, but I do not like the cold. I will not live in a town less than a day's ride from the wall. You are in the wrong kingdom if you hate the cold, Father teased. While Uncle Ned spoke only business with Sir Jaime, Father admired him. Well, if I go south, I have to deal with Southrons, Jaime said like a real Northman. I prefer the cold to the backstabbing. And now that I know the king is coming, I would ask leave to go. Well, choose a place. Choose a place we can both ride. I'm not staying here to deal with our beloved sister, Tyrion said. There are too many towers she could throw me from. Jaime snorted. If she were going to toss you from a window, she had her chance at Casterly Rock. Yes, but she wasn't a queen then, and she has a healthy fear of our father. Tywin Lannister is not here to tell her she is stupid, so her stupidity is more likely to grow legs and run amok. The queen is stupid? Arya asked. Aunt Cat's eyes went comically large. No, absolutely not. You will not repeat that. But he said. Ah, little wolf, Tyrion said, brothers and sisters say things about each other that are not true. For example, Sansa called you a troll, and yet I see no sign you are anything other than a girl. Uncle Ned's face turned thunderous, and he turned his gaze on Sansa. Jon almost felt sorry for her as her face lost all color. Arya turned on Sansa, her hands curled into fists. You called me a troll. She grabbed a handful of butter from the crock and flung it. It landed in Sansa's hair, or most of it did. A significant amount splashed onto Jane, who was sitting too close. Sansa screamed. Arya Stark! Aunt Cat yelled. Arya took one look at her mother and took off from the table with all the speed her 7-year-old legs could manage. Bran looked from his fleeing sister to his mother and ran after Arya. At 5, his short legs would never keep up with Arya, who was half wolf, but Jon kept his gaze on his plate. Perhaps a lack of siblings was not the worst curse. Aunt Cat pushed back from the table and took off, calling for a servant to find her daughter. Uncle Ned was still glaring at Sansa. I didn't mean it, Father. She got mud on my embroidery and I was angry. Is that a reason to betray your pack? He asked in a low voice. Sansa blushed and her hand fluttered around her head, hovering over the butter but not trying to wipe it from her curls. I am sorry, Father. I am not the one owed an apology. Jane, I believe you should excuse yourself to your room. She glanced at Sansa before standing and offering a curtsy. Yes, Lord Stark. Come, Sansa, Uncle Ned said, leading her from the room through the same door Arya had fled through. Once they were all gone, Tyrion said, is this what I missed by not having younger siblings? Yes, Jaime said while chewing. Father laughed. I missed it as well by being the youngest Stark. Truth told, Lyanna was the only sibling who even spoke to me. Ned was off in the Vale and Brandon. Well, Brandon was, he frowned. Arrogant Jaime said when he finished chewing. Hell, I was the same. We thought being the eldest sons of Lords Paramount meant that we answered to no one. My father taught me I was better than everyone, and the times that I met Brandon, he was the same. Father never talked about the siblings he lost, but now he sighed. True enough. I do not think he would have ridden to King's Landing had he not been raised to believe he could get anything he wanted. Rob's not like that, Jon said. Because your father is a better man than mine, Jaime said. Or mine, father said. Your grandfather loved his children, but he didn't treat us as people. He had an heir, a daughter to trade in marriage, a quiet son proper to marry a Southron girl, and an extra boy. I doubt he saw us as Brandon, Lyanna, Ned and Benjen. He liked his schemes and plans too much to notice real people were involved in his plots. Jon hated the idea that his grandfather had been so dismissive of the family he loved. He knew the elder Rickard Stark had planned to marry Lyanna away against her will and that he sent Uncle Ned to the Vale when he had not yet celebrated 8 name days. Jon knew Grandfather Stark had been a good lord, but anyone who schemed with others' lives was not a good person. He would not say that to his father, though. That was the sort of truth he would tell Arden when they sat in the Godswood talking about history and honor and leadership. You don't want to know what my father would call me, Tyrion said. So, are we going to plan a strategic retreat before our beloved sister appears on the horizon? If not, I have to hide a moon's worth of food in the most distant corner of the castle. Lord Stark the younger, Sir Jaime said to Jon's father, tell me you have any task that requires my attention elsewhere. With Arden gone, you are responsible for training the men. And you told Lord Bolton to keep his men home for 2 more moons. Now I know why. Actually, this explains why Arden left, too. You've known the king was coming for a while. Can you imagine what would happen if Bolton's men were here when the king showed up? Father asked. Lord Bolton's men were much rougher than most Northmen. Only Lord Umber's men came close. They'd even had a few fatalities on the training yards, and Father refused to let Jon train with them unless he was there to supervise. The Umber and Bolton men had always been more careful with Jon and other young men than they were with each other, but they spoke of things that well-bred men did not discuss. One even joked about having a wife who was a bear and lying with animals. In the old tongue, they called all animals bringers. A cow was a bringer of milk. A horse was a bringer of a saddle. Sheep were bringers of wool. They labeled them by the most important product they brought the tribe, and the Bolton men called bears bringers of fucks after Tormund's stories. The other men laughed uproariously, but Jon imagined the royal family would not appreciate their roughness or their humor. I do not want Lord Bolton's men's heads on pikes after they offend the Queen, Jon said. And I don't want my head on a pike when she sees I still breathe, Tyrion said. If she hated her youngest brother that much, she must be stupid. Tyrion was smart and funny and a little mean, but sometimes Jon liked the mean things he said about people. Father sighed. Very well. The Mandaealis have been reinforcing parts of Moat Cailin. They want a place to retreat to if White Harbor or House Lock is overrun. You can go work with them to develop plans to retreat and reinforce the ruins. Who could take White Harbor? Jon asked. The city was huge with fortifications to defend the docks. Every town can be taken if the enemy has the proper army, Sir Jaime said. Father studied Jon for a time, and Jon thought he was coming up with a different answer, but instead, his father said, Sir Jaime, take Jon with you. Show him how to design battle plans and keep working with him on melee skills. Jaime looked surprised, but Tyrion winked at Jon. If it was just the 3 of them on the road, they could play all kinds of pranks on Sir Jaime. Sure, Jaime said after a second. Minna Stark and Minna Lannister. If you 2 play one jape, I'll lock both of you in my trunk. I think I can get both in there at once. Tyrion loaded his knife with butter and used it like a catapult to fling the butter at Sir Jaime. It hit him between his eyes, and Jon laughed so hard that he snorted chewed bread and nearly choked. Maybe he didn't have siblings, but he had Lannisters. It was just as good. Chapter 17. Chapter text. Hightower called for Laena to enter the Solar, and she sank down into a chair without invitation. Her younger self would have been horrified at her lack of courtly manners, but Lena had grown lax and her bones ached. 3 years they had lived in this house, and she cursed every set of stairs. How goes her education? Fairly well, my lord. She excels in history and language, and she is fair in her music lessons, although she will never equal her mother the queen. That woman had a rare talent, one inherited only by Prince Rhaegar. However, she did bring up an issue I believe you must address. She shifted to take the pressure off her right hip. Had they still been in the Red Keep, she would have retired from childcare to sit in the sun with the queen gossiping about the young people in the palace. She and Rollo had discussed how much they would enjoy being old ladies together. Hightower looked up from the parchment he had been reading. Oh. What issue does she have? She asked about any potential betrothal contracts and whether she should study a particular realm of politics in order to be able to handle her husband's household. She was a good girl. Lena was proud of how she considered the future needs of her family. Then again, the female Targaryens had always been more responsible than the male ones. Generally. History had a few glaring exceptions. But the realm would have been better if the women had usurped their husbands. Hightower frowned. She has only 13 name days. Who is bringing the subjects to mind? Lena laughed. Spoken as a true man, my lord. Girls her age are being marched to septs right this moment. Hightower grimaced. She will not be wed when she is too young to carry a child. And she will not be wed until we have a suitable match, a good and honorable one. If Queen Rhaegar had lived, she would be preparing Daenerys. Lord Stark has a daughter of a similar age, and though she is a year younger, I have no doubt that she is already being trained to appeal either to northern lords or southern ones. If her lord father hopes to make her a match in the north, she is likely studying archery or horsemanship. If he hopes to make her the lady of a southern household, she will stay inside and practice embroidery and music. Parents set these expectations young. I would expect idiocy of that man, but I will not follow his example. One cannot know whether a potential marriage is feasible until both parties are older. We do not know where her best suitor will come from, just as Stark cannot know, and he limits his options by trying to guess. Lena huffed. They all knew that Stark's guesses went beyond the normal man's. He was a greenseer. Hightower had confessed as much in the letter he'd sent when he urged the Queen to flee Dragonstone while Hightower and Went were still in Dorne, unable to reach them. It is best to prepare. If the girl has no natural talent for archery or horsemanship, then the parents would know to look outside the north for a husband. Daenerys shall study what she finds natural to her. Hightower spoke the words as if it were definitive and Lena should stop speaking. However, Lena had been demanding men listen to her when Gerald Hightower was a mewling infant. He did not intimidate her. Daenerys has no natural talent for knife fighting, yet you and the others persist in teaching her so that if she is targeted she has a way to defend herself. Natural inclination does not mean much when a person has talented and persistent teachers. I've no doubt that the Tyrell daughter is being taught whichever pastimes the usurper's son most enjoys. After all, she is only a few years older than he, so it would be an appropriate match, even if Olenna would have to overcome the usurper's hatred of all things House Tyrell. Olenna would eat Robert Baratheon alive and use his bones to pick her teeth. Hightower's smile was dangerous and full of malice. She may have that opportunity. If she can get the Crown Prince's attention and make the young stag desire her granddaughter, then she can have Joffrey fight his father's prejudices against her house instead of her having to address it herself. No doubt there are any number of couriers in the capital who report on each food the prince shows a preference for and every hobby he takes up. And once she is in the palace, Robert and Cersei would be no match for the Queen of Thorns. My family was a noble one, and my parents never engaged in such games. I was a wet nurse for the Queen for 30 years. I have seen more nobles play those games than I have seen honest men. Daenerys' question is a reasonable one. What betrothal options are in her future? Do we teach her Westeros politics and have her learn the relationships between various bannermen and their lords paramount, or do we focus on the politics of Essos and the history of the free cities? We could have her study both, but she would be far better educated in politics at that point than most men, and men generally are unhappy with women who are educated to such a high level. I doubt it is the men who are unhappy, Hightower said. It is more likely that women with that much education are displeased with men who refuse to listen to their advice. Laena did not argue that point. I want Daenerys to have a good life, and she wants to know how to prepare so that her life can be as happy as possible. She does not know that Stark provides us coin, but I have known since the day the letter arrived on Dragonstone telling us that the war was lost and that Robert Baratheon was targeting us. The Queen thought Stark was attempting to move us from a fortified position until the Maester showed her how much gold Stark had sent so that we could flee. Does he intend to marry Daenerys to one of his sons and use her to claim the Iron Throne for his line? He was descended from the Winter Kings, so his heir would be a good match. That question demonstrates that you do not understand Ned Stark. The man is far too interested in honor to ever play the Game of Thrones. Despite his vaunted honor, he sends coin to the enemies of his chosen king. His honor made him challenge the king and demand blood for the deaths of Rhaegar's 2 children. Again, Hightower specified that Rhaegar's 2 children had died in the Red Keep. If Rhaegar only had 2 children, why would the commander continue to specify the number? Even if the queen had not confided in her, Laena would have smelled the plot when the stench of one drifted past her nose. He argued that they should have been sent before the king's council, which likely would have led to their deaths anyway. Considering how the prince's 2 children died, a legal council and the milk of Poppy would have been a mercy. Besides, Oberyn was there. He could have argued for mercy. Rhaenys could have been pledged to the 7. Aegon could have been removed from the line of succession as the most recent Aemon Targaryen was. Hightower clenched his teeth before he said in a pained voice, "My greatest regret was that Prince Rhaegar's orders kept me from the capital." Another interesting detail. Rhaegar ordered Dane, Went and Commander Hightower away from the Red Keep, and yet he did not allow them to ride to war with him. They must have been with the girl. However, if Hightower would answer the question of Daenerys' training, she could confirm that Lyanna's child had survived. Any child would be a bastard, or at best the issue of unquestionable second marriage by a rogue September. The legitimacy would never be secure at any rate. But if that child was free of the Targaryen madness and married Daenerys, their children would be the indisputable heirs. Had you been there and had you attempted to protect the princess and her children, King Aerys would have killed them much quicker, and perhaps in an even more brutal way. He always did feel that Princess Elia's blood had corrupted his grandchildren to the point that they did not deserve to live. They were hostages to their father's good behavior and nothing else, Laena reassured him. Most of those in the Red Keep were hostages at the end, Hightower said, and Laena did not argue the point. Those had been dark days, but the ones that had followed had been worse. The few reports that she had received from the servants who had survived suggested that the Lannisters had been even more brutal than Mad King Aerys himself. They had raped women and girls and boys and men in the streets. They had cut open holes in bodies so that they could use them for their own gratification. Under Aerys, the small folk had known to avoid the keep, and if they did, they would live in a prosperous and safe kingdom. But there had been no safety from the Lannisters' monsters. Hightower took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. Stark has the pieces to play the Game of Thrones, but not the will. He does not want to see his family on that throne any more than he himself was willing to take it. Then Westeros is condemned to an endless string of bad kings, Laena said. For Hightower to say Stark had the pieces suggested he knew the hidden child, possibly that he controlled him. And what shall be Daenerys' fate? She also wonders if she shall be forced to marry her brother as her parents were forced to marry. Absolutely not. Hightower snapped with the sort of visceral disgust that reassured Laena that their protectors were not going to sacrifice another Targaryen woman to the ego of a Targaryen man. They had certainly never defended the queen from the humiliations and beatings Aerys had subjected her to. Ironically, the little Lannister boy was the only one to show distress at Rhaegar's suffering, yet rumor said that he was called Oathbreaker and mad. A man who held a king accountable for the harm done a woman was mad. Good, because I am of an age where I no longer value my own survival enough to stand by while someone hurts those in my charge. Not again. It is the young that fear for their lives, and my bones ache far too much for me to maintain the illusion of youth. She shifted in her chair again, partly as a mummery to reinforce her words and partly because her hips did ache when she sat in these damnably hard chairs Hightower used to chase guests from his solar. You tell me what you will not do, but the question is, what shall we do? Will we seek out some white-haired, violet-eyed boy that might be a Dragoseed in order to maintain strong Valerian blood. Will we seek out the son of a powerful city leader? If you try to marry her off to some 60-year-old magister with gout and a hanging belly, I will remind you that I am old, and proficient in many court skills, and as I pointed out before, my age makes me rather reckless with my own safety. She smiled sweetly, but she had no doubt that he remembered how much poison had been a part of the court when Aes had been young. Young courtiers had even given various poisons cute little code names. The Purple Kiss, Sweet Breath, Tears of Lies, Hope and Honey, The Strangler, Long Farewell. All the women of her age knew them as the young men knew the names of those that found fame at the tourney. Hightower sighed. None of us know what tomorrow will bring. I may wake you up during the dark of the morning and tell you we must flee to a different city. I may kill an assassin in the courtyard as I'm walking to my evening meal. We cannot plan for a future that we are unable to predict. Laena had listened to some variation on this speech for many years. But she was tired, and it had been many, many years since anyone from Westeros has sought them out. Perhaps it was time for her to stop keeping her queen's secrets and start using information the way these men did. Is that the tact Lord Stark is taking with the young prince? She might not know enough of Westeros and the current state of the families to be able to pin down where the child was hidden, but she could shoot an arrow close enough to flush her prey. Hightower went utterly still. She was almost sure that he had stopped breathing, but only for a moment. And then his quill scratched over the surface of his parchment and he schooled his features into a look of disinterest. What young prince are you speaking of? I don't believe the usurper plans to foster the Baratheon heir out to Winterfell. Laena snorted. If this was the best Hightower could do, his skills at subterfuge and misdirection were woefully inadequate. My queen received a letter from her son, an apology of sorts. It appears that Princess Elia wished to go home to Dorne, and Prince Rhaegar wished to have another child, a Visenya who would complete his rather arrogant set of children. Imagine naming all three of your children after the conquerors of Westeros. She knew that the nobles liked to describe Rhaegar as the kind Targaryen, the honorable one. However, she had been his wet nurse, so she thought she knew him best, and while he lacked cruelty, he had arrogance enough to anger most men. She could not even feign surprise that he would dishonor a noble lady and ignore all social obligation to speak to her parents. Are you saying Prince Rhaegar had a bastard daughter out there somewhere? Hightower's mummery was so overdramatic that Laena had to resist the urge to laugh in the man's face. You are a terrible liar. Hightower put down his quill and studied her. I'm a rather accomplished liar, but you are not being clear. Is there some bastard out there that we don't know about? We can find them and bring them here to safety if that's what you are asking. I'm asking what Lord Stark is doing to prepare the young prince for his future. Lyanna had been convinced she carried a boy, and Laena tended to put more faith in mothers than fathers on the issue of gender. Is he raising the prince to eventually take his place on the Iron Throne? Does he plan to marry the prince to the Baratheon daughter and get rid of little Joffrey? That appears out of character for a man of Lord Stark's nature, but I found men will do much to get their kin on the throne. Hightower continued to stare at her. The Queen received letters from Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. We knew that she was pregnant and that they both believed the pregnancy served the prophecy. Hightower sagged in his chair. He dropped his quill and rubbed his hand over his face. Daemon Stark is the greatest secret kept in this manse. We cannot speak openly of it. We call him the Hidden Dragon, and his uncle the Idiot because he believes his family will have nothing to do with the game. Daemon. That was Lyanna's favorite Targaryen, or at least she guessed that he was when she wrote to the Queen favoring Daemon as the child's name. The Queen and I agreed that she was likely trying to tell us that she did not plan for her child to overshadow his siblings. After all, Daemon the Glorious is a footnote in history, not a name associated with greatness. Hightower closed his eyes as though a great weariness had captured his soul. He will never have a chance to live in his siblings' shadows. He is all that is left. At least Daemon is a proper name, not like Gajan. Gajan. Jon. She had made a point of gathering information on Dorne and the North, their two benefactors. When Stark built Castle Lyanna and gifted it to his younger brother, she had noted that the younger Lord Stark had fathered a bastard at an age where most young men couldn't figure out how to make their hand and cock work in concert. Jon Snow. Jon Snow. They hid the prince within easy sight of anyone who looked. Hightower gave her a long look. How long have you known? I've always known, she lied. She suspected there was a boy out there somewhere, but she thought him lost. Lyanna had never written again, and then word arrived that her brother returned with her bones, but no one mentioned a babe. Those letters were a major reason why the Queen and I decided to take Lord Stark's advice and his gold and flee Dragonstone. We were guarding Lyanna when the babe was born. Laena nodded. Arthur went with the boy, didn't he? He did. So Lord Stark is training the boy for war. Shall we have another battle for the Iron Throne, only this time between the usurper and a man most well known for being his loyal dog? Hightower shook his head. I meant what I said. Stark wishes to keep his blood off the throne. He would not approve of any match between his kin and Daenerys because it would force a war. Laena frowned. Then why is he supporting us in exile? Starks are odd creatures. I learned that in the months that I guarded Lyanna at the Tower of Joy. They grow up in a place where winter takes one person out of every 10, so death is a familiar friend they do not seek to avoid. Instead, they are focused on their duty and what must be accomplished to get themselves or their families through the next winter. Those are their house words, you know, winter is coming. Lyanna believed in Rhaegar's prophecy and that winter was coming for all of us. She gave him a child to help fight the coming darkness. 7 Save us. Laena pressed her fingertips against her forehead. If the first word she would use to describe Rhaegar were arrogant, the second would be obsessive. He was a kind boy, a good boy, but he was not a well-balanced boy, and he had grown into an unbalanced man. 7 Save us. She always sounded like such a practical girl in the letters I read the Queen. How could she believe this prophecy? I do not know, Hightower said. When she came to the tower, she was charmed by Rhaegar and his promise of protection. She sent ravens off to her father and eldest brother praising his gentlemanly ways, and she looked on him with the wide eyes of youth. But by the time she was pregnant, they had developed an odd relationship, one more like two soldiers in the field camping together than two lovers. She bit her lip as she struggled to avoid cursing the name of that little boy she still loved even though his stupidity infuriated her. But it grows worse, Hightower said. Her brother is a green seer. This I knew. You told the Queen and me as much in your letters. Is it possible Rhaegar sought out another with strong magic in their family line and he knew of the green seeing? I cannot say, but Stark's visions led him to us in Dawn and led him to bring a Maester specializing in childbirth. He knew that he would find her near to giving birth and he knew that her birth would be a difficult one. The Maester was not able to save Lyanna, but he tried. I have never seen a man so devastated at his own failure. But his green seer dreams means that he too believes in the prophecy. He raises the prince not to sit on the Iron Throne but to lead the realms of man against evil. Laena looked at Hightower to see whether he was jesting. No sane man, much less a practical northerner, would ever listen to the claptrap Rhaegar spouted when he started offering his interpretations of the prince who was promised. By the 7, he had spent much of his childhood telling everyone that he was that prince, a sure sign of the arrogance that would follow him into adulthood. You ask how he is raising the boy, and I tell you that he is raising him to fulfill the prophecy. Rhaegar believed that saving the world and ruling it were the same thing, as if a man who does a good deed does so only for power. Lord Stark is determined that Gaemon will take up the mantle of saving the realms of men but that he will not be trapped in the role of king. So he hopes to save the realms of men from whatever mythical monsters haunt the shadows and then leave them to starve under Baratheon's mismanagement. That is an interesting philosophy of life. I do not think the small folk care whether it is some monster from children's tales that kills them or whether it's starvation. In fact, I rather think they would prefer a quick death. Watching your children starve while the liege lord you are sworn to does nothing must be a special form of torture for parents. Laena watched as Hightower shifted in his chair. His might be padded, but either the chair or this conversation made the man uncomfortable. We are well aware of the fact that the usurper is proving himself unsuitable for the role, and we are taking steps. I assume you are also aware that unseating the usurper will plunge all 7 kingdoms into a grand civil war as each tries to put his own blood on the throne. 5 kingdoms. Dawn will refuse to bend the knee if they do not control the throne. The North will declare independence, pointing out that they were never conquered and they have the right to rule themselves. They bent to the knee willingly. Hightower pursed his lips and picked up his quill, twirling it between his fingers. We have sent for many books on the North since we have been exiled, and I feel I understand them now as no Southron has before. They feel magic and prophecy as much as Rhaegar did. They bent to the knee for the Pact of Fire and Ice. The scrolls say that their green seers foresaw the need for Targaryen magic, so they bent the knee with the understanding that Targaryens would marry into their line and their blood would carry both fire and ice. That contract was never fulfilled, giving them lawful cause to declare themselves independent. But it was fulfilled in Gaemon. Hightower tilted his head in her direction. They could admit that the pact was fulfilled with Gaemon, and the other 6 kingdoms will recognize that he is the only candidate who will prevent a civil